Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right, and let your shoulders drop just a little. There's no rush at all. We have all the time in the world. Wherever you are right now, a quiet bedroom as the night deepens around you, a cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally beginning to lift, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to travel together through one of the most ambitious economic experiments in all of human history. We're going to explore how 23 centuries of separate nations, each with their own currencies, their own financial histories, their own deeply held ideas about money and sovereignty and identity, decided to try something that had never been done before at this scale. We're going to follow the long, slow story of the euro, how it was dreamed, how it was built, how it was tested nearly to breaking, and how it endures. This is not a story that needs to be followed anxiously. All of it has already happened. All of it has already unfolded in its own time. You can simply let it wash over you, and if at any point you drift away into sleep, that is exactly what we're here for. Let's begin. Imagine for a moment that you're standing at a border crossing somewhere in the heart of Europe. Not the Europe of today, but the Europe of 50 or 60 years ago. The Europe of the 1960s, or the 1970s, a continent still shaped by the memory of war, still divided by the small but significant friction of national difference. The road stretches ahead of you through farmland or forest. A customs booth stands at the line where one country ends and another begins. And in your pocket, or in your wallet, or in a small envelope tucked into your luggage, you are carrying money that is about to become nearly worthless. Not worthless in the way that money becomes worthless during a crisis or a collapse. Worthless in the smaller, quieter, more ordinary sense, the sense that the francs in your pocket, perfectly good for buying bread or paying for a room on the side of the border you just left, will need to be exchanged before you can use them on the side you're approaching. You will hand over your francs and receive marks, or lire, or guilders, or pesetas, and in that exchange, a small but real portion of your money will simply disappear, taken as a fee by the bank or the exchange booth, eaten up by the difference between the rate at which they will buy your currency and the rate at which they will sell you the new one. This was the texture of everyday economic life in post-war Europe. It was not dramatic, it was not catastrophic. It was simply a constant low-level friction, a tax on movement, a small reminder at every crossing that you had left one world and entered another, and that the two worlds ran on different financial systems that did not quite trust each other to stay in alignment. For an ordinary tourist, this was an inconvenience. You lost a little money at the exchange booth, you received unfamiliar coins that felt strange in your hand, and you spent a few minutes recalibrating, reminding yourself what things actually cost in this new denomination, trying to remember whether a figure that sounded large was actually large, or whether the zeros were deceiving you. The Italian lira, for instance, came in such large numbers that first-time visitors often felt briefly, bewilderingly wealthy, before remembering that thousands of lire were worth only a few dollars or a few marks. But for a business operating across borders, the problem was considerably more serious than mere inconvenience. Consider a German manufacturer in the 1970s who wanted to sell machinery to a customer in France. The machinery would be priced in Deutsche Marks, Germany's currency at the time, the currency in which the manufacturer paid his workers and his suppliers. The French customer would need to pay in francs, France's currency, the one his own bank accounts held. And between the moment the contract was signed and the moment the payment arrived, the exchange rate between marks and francs might have moved. It moved all the time, in fact, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, because currencies in those years floated against one another, their relative values determined by markets, by expectations, by the flows of capital and trade that pulled them this way and that. So the German manufacturer faced a choice. He could price his machinery in marks and let the French customer bear the exchange rate risk. But then the French customer might buy from someone else, someone who priced in francs and removed that uncertainty. He could price in francs and bear the risk himself. But then a shift in the exchange rate between signing the contract and receiving payment might turn a profitable sale into a loss. Or he could pay to hedge the risk through financial instruments, locking in an exchange rate in advance. But that cost money too, money that reduced his profit margin, money that made doing business across the border more expensive than doing business at home. Multiply this friction across tens of thousands of companies, across millions of transactions, across a continent of trading partners who needed each other's goods and services, but who were separated by this constant low-level currency uncertainty, and you begin to understand why economists and politicians started to dream of something different. But to understand the dream of a shared European currency, you need to understand something deeper than economics. You need to understand what Europe had just lived through. The Second World War ended in 1945, leaving a continent that had, in the space of 30 years, fought two wars of unprecedented destruction. The first had killed somewhere between 17 and 20 million people. The second had killed perhaps 70 to 85 million. These numbers are so large that they stop meaning anything if you look at them directly. They need to be approached from the side through individual stories, through the specific cities reduced to rubble, through the specific families torn apart. Europe in 1945 was a place of extraordinary physical destruction and extraordinary psychological exhaustion. An entire generation had grown up under the shadow of violence, and the generation before them had grown up under the shadow of the war before that. The men and women who began building European institutions in the late 1940s and early 1950s, people like the French statesman Robert Schuman and the French economist and diplomat Jean Monnet and the German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, carried this history in their bones. They were not primarily concerned with exchange rate friction or trade statistics. They were concerned with preventing catastrophe from happening again, and they believed, with a conviction that was almost spiritual in its intensity, that the way to prevent European nations from going to war with each other was to bind them together so tightly economically that war between them would become not just undesirable, but genuinely unthinkable. Jean Monnet, who is perhaps the most important figure in the intellectual history of European integration, once described his approach with elegant simplicity. He believed that nations could not be asked to trust each other in the abstract, through declarations of goodwill and fine speeches about peace. Trust had to be built through shared institutions, through practical cooperation, through the creation of common interests so real and so substantial that conflict would mean destroying things nations actually depended upon. You don't go to war with your supplier. You don't bomb your customer. The first concrete expression of this idea was the European Coal and Steel Community, established in 1951. 6 nations, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, agreed to place their coal and steel industries under common management. Coal and steel were not chosen randomly. They were the raw materials of warfare, the industries that powered armies and built weapons. By sharing control of them, the founding nations were making a statement. These resources would no longer be available for national military ambition alone. They would be managed collectively in the common interest. It was a modest beginning. Coal and steel were important, but they were not the whole of an economy. Yet the logic it established was powerful, and it pointed towards something larger. If coal and steel could be managed together, why not agriculture? Why not trade? Why not eventually money itself? The Treaty of Rome, signed in 1957, created the European Economic Community, what people at the time called the Common Market. The 6 founding nations of the coal and steel community agreed to work toward a genuine common market, eliminating tariffs and quotas between themselves, allowing goods to move freely across their borders as if those borders did not exist for economic purposes. It was an ambitious undertaking, and it worked better than many had expected. Trade between the 6 nations grew substantially through the 1960s. Businesses that had previously sold only within their home country discovered customers across the border. Consumers found goods they had never had access to before. And yet, underlying all this growing economic integration, the currencies remained separate. The franc was still the franc. The mark was still the mark. The lyre was still the lyre. Each nation controlled its own monetary policy, set its own interest rates, managed its own money supply, and each nation, when it ran into economic difficulty, retained the option of devaluing its currency, making its exports cheaper and its imports more expensive, adjusting the exchange rate to restore competitiveness rather than enduring the more painful process of cutting wages or reducing prices. This devaluation option was, for many economists and policymakers, the great virtue of separate national currencies. It was a pressure valve. It allowed countries to adjust to economic shocks in ways that were painful but manageable, rather than enduring adjustments that might be catastrophic. If France fell behind Germany in productivity and competitiveness, France could devalue the franc, and French exports would become cheaper and more competitive again without requiring French workers to accept dramatic wage cuts. The currency absorbed the shock so that wages and employment did not have to absorb it instead. But this same flexibility that economists prized was, in practice, a source of ongoing uncertainty and friction. If France might devalue the franc, then a German company selling to French customers always had to consider that possibility. If Italy might depreciate the lira, then a Dutch investor considering Italian assets had to price in that risk. Currency uncertainty was not just an abstract concern, it showed up in interest rates. Italian interest rates were persistently higher than German ones because investors demanded compensation for the risk that the lira might lose value, and in the cost of capital for Italian businesses, and in the decisions of companies about where to invest and where to build factories. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, as European economic integration deepened in some ways while remaining stubbornly incomplete in others, the question of what to do about currencies hovered in the background. And then, in the early 1970s, an event on the other side of the Atlantic forced it into the foreground with sudden and uncomfortable urgency. In August of 1971, the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, announced that the dollar would no longer be convertible into gold at a fixed rate. This decision, taken unilaterally without consultation with America's allies, brought down a system called Bretton Woods that had governed international monetary relations since the end of the Second World War. Under Bretton Woods, most major currencies had been fixed against the dollar, and the dollar had been fixed against gold at $35 per ounce. The system provided stability and predictability for international trade. It also required countries to maintain their exchange rates within tight bands, which constrained their monetary policy in ways that became increasingly uncomfortable as the 1960s wore on. With Bretton Woods gone, the major currencies of the world, including the European ones, began to float freely against each other, their values determined by the shifting tides of currency markets. For Europe, this was alarming. The whole project of building a common market depended on stable, predictable economic relationships between member countries. But now the franc might swing sharply against the mark, and the mark against the lyre, in ways that disrupted trade patterns and undermined the confidence of businesses trying to plan across borders. European governments responded by trying to coordinate their currencies even without the anchor of Bretton Woods, attempting to keep their exchange rates aligned with each other through what was nicknamed the snake in the tunnel, an early system of currency coordination that proved difficult to maintain in the face of the economic turbulence of the 1970s. Oil prices quadrupled in 1973 after the Arab oil embargo. Inflation rose sharply across Europe. Different countries responded in different ways, with different fiscal policies and different monetary policies, and the pressures on fixed exchange rates between them became enormous. The snake in the tunnel repeatedly broke down as one country or another found it impossible to maintain its exchange rate and was forced to devalue. These repeated failures were discouraging, but they were also instructive. They suggested that halfway measures, trying to keep currencies aligned without actually merging them, were unstable. They worked when everything was going well and fell apart precisely when they were most needed, when economic conditions were difficult and divergence between national economies was greatest. The lesson some drew was that Europe needed to go further, not stop halfway. The lesson others drew was that currency coordination was simply too difficult and should be abandoned. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the debate continued. The European monetary system, created in 1979, introduced a new framework for currency coordination, the exchange rate mechanism, in which European currencies would be kept within agreed bands against each other, with governments and central banks obliged to intervene in currency markets when exchange rates approached the edges of their permitted range. It was more flexible than the old Bretton Woods system, and more realistic about the occasional need for realignment. And it worked better than its predecessors, providing a period of relative currency stability through much of the 1980s. But it was still not a single currency. The barriers were lower, the friction was reduced, but they were still there, at every border crossing, in every cross-border transaction, in every business plan that had to account for the possibility that the exchange rate might shift before the contract was completed. And as the European Community, as it was now called, deepened its integration through the 1980s, those barriers came to seem increasingly anomalous. In 1985, the Community's executive body proposed completing the single market, not just reducing barriers to trade but genuinely eliminating them, creating a space in which goods, services, capital and people could move as freely as they moved within a single country. The Single European Act, signed in 1986, committed member states to achieving this goal by the end of 1992. It was an enormous undertaking, requiring the harmonization of thousands of regulations, the removal of hundreds of specific barriers, the alignment of standards and practices across 12 different national systems. And as the single market project gathered momentum, a question grew increasingly difficult to ignore. What was the point of eliminating all these other barriers if currencies still fluctuated? If a French company could sell freely to German customers without tariffs or quotas, but still had to bear the cost and risk of currency exchange? Was the single market really complete? Was a market truly single if the prices within it were expressed in a dozen different units that moved against each other from day to day? Jacques Delors, the French economist who served as president of the European Commission from 1985 to 1995, was one of the most important advocates for completing the single market with a single currency. He commissioned a report, published in 1989 and bearing his name, that laid out a detailed plan for moving toward economic and monetary union in 3 stages: deepening coordination, then convergence, then full monetary union with a single currency, managed by a single central bank. The Delors report was careful and technical. It acknowledged the difficulties. It mapped out the conditions that would need to be met, and it made an argument that would become increasingly influential: that a genuine single market and separate national currencies were not ultimately compatible. Either Europe would move forward toward monetary union, or it would find that the single market itself would be undermined by exchange rate instability. There was no stable middle ground. The logic of integration, once started, had a direction. Not everyone agreed. Many economists, particularly in Britain and Scandinavia, argued that the case for a single currency was overstated, that the costs of giving up the flexibility of national currencies outweighed the benefits of eliminating exchange rate friction. The academic debate about optimal currency areas, about what conditions needed to be satisfied for a group of countries to share a currency successfully, had been ongoing since the Canadian economist Robert Mundell had first formalised it in the early 1960s, and it was far from settled. But events would move faster than academic debates. By the time the Delors report was published in the spring of 1989, something extraordinary was already beginning to happen in the eastern half of Europe, something that would transform the political landscape of the continent and give the project of monetary union an urgency it had never quite had before. The Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989, and with it, the shape of Europe began to change in ways that would make the question of a shared currency suddenly, pressingly, unavoidably political. But we will come to that in the next part of our journey. For now, let the image of that European traveller rest in your mind, standing at a border booth, exchanging currencies, watching a small portion of their money disappear in the transaction, wondering if perhaps there might someday be a simpler way. It is a small, quiet image, but it contains, in miniature, the entire logic of what would eventually become the euro. Let it settle gently as you breathe. There is no hurry. The story will continue when you are ready. The Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of November, 1989. If you were alive then and old enough to watch the news, you may remember the images: the crowds gathering on both sides of the wall, the young men climbing up onto its concrete surface, the hammers beginning to strike, the fragments breaking away. It was one of those moments in history that feels, even as it is happening, like a hinge, a point at which the world turns and everything that comes after is recognisably different from everything that came before. For European monetary union, the fall of the wall was not just a symbolic moment, it was a catalyst. And to understand why, you need to understand what Germany meant to Europe in 1989, and what a reunified Germany meant to France. West Germany had spent the 4 decades since the Second World War rebuilding itself into something extraordinary. From the rubble and shame of 1945, it had constructed the most powerful economy in Europe, disciplined, export-oriented, technologically sophisticated, and anchored by a currency, the Deutsche Mark, that had become a symbol of everything the new Germany wanted to be. The Deutsche Mark was not just money. It was a statement. It represented the rejection of the hyperinflation of the 1920s and early 1930s, the catastrophic monetary disorder that had destroyed savings, destabilized society, and contributed, in ways historians still debate, to the political conditions that made the Nazi period possible. The West German Bundesbank, the central bank that managed the mark, had been given an extraordinary degree of independence and a single overriding mandate to maintain price stability, to keep inflation low, to protect the currency's value above all else. And it had done so with a consistency and credibility that made the Deutsche Mark the anchor of the European monetary system, the currency against which all the others measured themselves. Now imagine, from France's perspective, what it meant when Germany began moving toward reunification with its eastern half in the winter of 1989 and into 1990. A Germany that was already the dominant economic power in Europe was about to become larger. 16 million additional citizens, an entire additional territory, a country of 80 million people at the heart of the continent. French policymakers, and French President François Mitterrand in particular, looked at this prospect with a mixture of genuine celebration for the German people and quiet strategic concern for France's position. A larger, more powerful Germany, still sovereign over its own monetary policy, still able to set interest rates for the entire European monetary system through the decisions of the Bundesbank. This was a Germany that France would find increasingly difficult to balance. The solution that Mitterrand and his advisers developed, in close and remarkably candid negotiation with German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, was elegant in its logic. France would support German reunification, would not stand in its way, would not try to slow it down, would not join those European voices urging caution, and in return Germany would agree to give up the Deutsche Mark. It would pool its monetary sovereignty with its European partners into a shared currency managed by a shared institution. Germany would become larger, but the larger Germany would be embedded more deeply than ever in European structures, its monetary power distributed rather than concentrated, its future bound irrevocably to the future of its neighbours. Helmut Kohl, who was both a committed European and a practical politician, understood the offer. He was old enough to carry personal memory of what European division and nationalist competition had cost. He believed in European integration as something more than a trade arrangement, as a genuine political project, a peace project, the completion of something his generation had a particular responsibility to finish. He agreed. This exchange, French support for reunification in return for German commitment to monetary union, was never spelled out quite so transactionally in public. Politics rarely is. But those who were in the rooms where these conversations happened have described it with enough consistency that the outlines are clear. The euro, when it eventually arrived, was built partly on this foundation, a diplomatic bargain struck at a moment of geopolitical transformation, as much about managing the balance of power in Europe as about eliminating exchange rate friction. The formal framework for monetary union was negotiated through 1990 and into 1991, and agreed at a summit in the Dutch city of Maastricht in December of 1991. The Maastricht Treaty, which entered into force in November of 1993, did several things simultaneously. It created the European Union as a broader political entity. It established a citizenship of the Union. It set out plans for common foreign and defence policies. And at its economic core, it laid out the path to a single currency, with a detailed set of conditions, the convergence criteria, that nations would need to satisfy before they could join. The convergence criteria were demanding, and they were demanding deliberately. Germany's insistence on them reflected a genuine fear, not an unreasonable one given history, that being tied to other countries' monetary policies meant being exposed to other countries' fiscal irresponsibility. If a country spent recklessly, ran large deficits, accumulated substantial debts, and then joined a currency union, it could effectively import financial stability from its more disciplined partners while continuing to behave badly. Its interest rates would fall to the lower levels of the shared currency, its borrowing would become cheaper, and the costs of its irresponsibility would be spread across the Union. Germany was not willing to allow this. The price of German participation was criteria strict enough to ensure that only genuinely convergent economies would be admitted. The criteria, as written into the Maastricht Treaty, covered four main areas: inflation had to be no more than 1.5 percentage points above the average of the 3 lowest inflation member states, a requirement that pushed countries toward price stability before joining. Long-term interest rates had to be no more than 2 percentage points above the same benchmark, a market-based confirmation that investors believed in a country's economic management. The government's annual budget deficit had to be no more than 3% of gross domestic product, a limit on fiscal looseness, and total government debt had to be no more than 60% of gross domestic product, or at least moving convincingly in that direction. These numbers, 3% and 60%, would become the most discussed, most debated, most creatively interpreted figures in European economic policy for the next 3 decades. They were not derived from deep economic theory. There was no particular reason, beyond a general sense of prudence, why 3% was the right deficit limit, rather than 2.5% or 4%. The 60% debt limit was partly based on the debt levels that several European countries happened to have at the time the treaty was negotiated, but once written into treaty law, they acquired a kind of authority that transcended their somewhat arbitrary origins. They became the definition of fiscal responsibility in the European context, the standard against which governments measured themselves and were measured by their partners. Not everyone found the criteria convincing or desirable. Economists who worried about the rigidities of currency union argued that the convergence criteria focused on the wrong things, that inflation rates and deficit levels were less important than the structural similarities between economies, the flexibility of labour markets, the patterns of trade and investment that would determine whether a single monetary policy could serve many different national economies well. The academic debate about optimal currency areas that we touched on earlier, the framework developed by Robert Mundell in the early 1960s, suggested that a currency union worked best when its member economies were closely integrated. When workers could move freely between regions in response to economic conditions, and when some mechanism existed to transfer resources from regions doing well to regions doing badly. Europe satisfied some of these conditions, but not all of them, and critics worried that the Maastricht criteria did not adequately address the deeper question of whether European economies were structurally suited to share a currency. But the political momentum was substantial, and it carried the project forward even through moments of serious doubt. The most serious of these moments came in September of 1992, when the European Monetary System's exchange rate mechanism, the framework of aligned exchange rates that was supposed to be the transition path toward full monetary union, came under devastating speculative attack. The mechanism had been operating under increasing strain through 1991 and into 1992. German reunification had proven more expensive than initially anticipated. The costs of integrating the Eastern German economy, rebuilding its infrastructure, converting its industries, supporting its population through the transition, were enormous. The German government borrowed heavily to finance reunification, and the Bundesbank, true to its anti-inflation mandate, raised interest rates to prevent this borrowing from generating inflationary pressure. German interest rates in the early 1990s were high, very high by the standards of the time. For other countries in the exchange rate mechanism, this created a painful problem. Their currencies were locked in alignment with the Deutsche Mark. To maintain that alignment, they had to keep their own interest rates high enough to prevent investors from selling their currencies and buying marks instead. But high interest rates were exactly what several of these countries did not need. Britain, which had joined the mechanism only in 1990, was experiencing a recession. Its housing market had collapsed. Unemployment was rising. What British businesses and homeowners needed was lower interest rates, cheaper borrowing, more support for a weakening economy. Instead, Britain was trapped. To keep the pound aligned with the mark, it had to keep rates high, making the recession worse. Currency traders and investors began to notice this tension. They began to ask whether Britain could really maintain the pound's position within the mechanism, or whether the economic pressure would eventually force a devaluation. The more they asked the question, the more they moved money out of pounds and into marks as a precaution. The more money moved out of pounds, the more the Bank of England had to spend buying pounds to support the exchange rate. And the more it spent, the more obvious it became that its reserves were finite, and that the defence of the pound's position was not indefinitely sustainable. The man who made this calculation most precisely, and who acted on it most boldly, was a Hungarian-born American investor named George Soros. Through his fund, operating in the currency markets, Soros built up a position that effectively bet against the pound, betting that Britain would be forced to devalue. The position was enormous, in the range of $10 billion. It was, in the language of financial markets, a one-way bet. If Britain maintained the pound's position, Soros would lose relatively little. If Britain was forced to devalue, he would make a very large amount of money. On the 16th of September, 1992, a day that became known as Black Wednesday in Britain, the bet resolved itself. Despite dramatic and increasingly desperate measures by the British government, including raising interest rates to 12% and then to 15% in a single day, the pressure on the pound proved irresistible. By the evening, Britain had withdrawn from the exchange rate mechanism. The pound was allowed to float freely. It fell sharply. George Soros reportedly made a profit of around $1 billion in a single day. The British government had spent billions of pounds from its foreign exchange reserves in a failed attempt to hold the line. Italy's lira was forced out of the mechanism on the same day. Other currencies, the Spanish peseta, the Portuguese escudo, the Irish pound, came under intense pressure and were devalued within their bands. The exchange rate mechanism, the carefully constructed framework that was supposed to be the path to monetary union, had suffered a crisis of enormous proportions. The lessons drawn from this crisis depended, as economic lessons often do, on what you already believed. Those who were sceptical of monetary union saw it as confirmation that tying currencies together without full political and fiscal union was inherently unstable, that the halfway house of the exchange rate mechanism was neither stable enough to work nor flexible enough to adapt. Britain's experience in particular seemed to many British commentators to be a powerful argument for keeping the pound and maintaining the ability to devalue in response to economic conditions. The pound's depreciation after September of 1992 was, in economic terms, relatively successful. It made British exports more competitive, it allowed interest rates to fall, and the British economy recovered over the following years in ways that might not have been possible had the pound remained locked in the mechanism. But those who supported monetary union drew a different conclusion from the same events. They argued that the crisis demonstrated not that currency alignment was impossible, but that it was impossible halfway. The exchange rate mechanism had always been vulnerable to speculative attack, precisely because currencies remained technically separate and technically devaluable. A genuine single currency could not be attacked in the same way, because there was no exchange rate to defend, no mechanism for devaluation, no way for a speculator to bet that one member's currency would weaken against another's. The crisis of September 1992 on this reading was an argument for going faster and further toward full monetary union, not for stopping short of it. This second interpretation was the one that prevailed among the European governments most committed to the project. Germany and France remained firm. The negotiations that would eventually produce the euro continued. The Maastricht Treaty was ratified, though not without difficulty. In Denmark, a referendum in June of 1992 rejected the treaty, forcing a renegotiation of Denmark's terms and a second vote the following year. In France, a referendum in September of 1992 passed by the narrowest of margins, 51% in favour, 49% against, a result so close that it became known as the quote won the small yes. It was a reminder that the project of monetary union was not universally popular even among the nations most committed to European integration, that it was being built over the doubts and reservations of substantial portions of the populations it would affect. The years between the Maastricht Treaty and the eventual launch of the euro were years of what might be called disciplined anticipation. Governments that wanted to join the single currency had to actually achieve the convergence criteria, to bring their inflation rates down, their interest rates down, their budget deficits down, their debt trajectories into at least the appearance of sustainability. This was genuinely difficult for some of them. Italy, which had a long history of high inflation and substantial government debt well above the 60% of gross domestic product threshold, undertook a determined effort to qualify. Spain and Portugal, which had only relatively recently transitioned from dictatorship to democracy and were still catching up economically with Northern Europe, worked hard to bring their economic indicators into line. The convergence that occurred through the 1990s was real, at least on the measures the treaty specified. Inflation fell across Europe. Interest rates converged, with the previously high rates of southern European countries falling steadily toward German levels, as investors began to believe that these countries would genuinely join the single currency, and that their monetary policy would therefore be set by the same institution, targeting the same inflation rate as Germany's. This convergence in interest rates was itself a preview of what membership would bring, and for countries that had been accustomed to paying 8 or 9 or 10% to borrow money, the prospect of borrowing at rates closer to 5 or 6% was enormously attractive. The political support for monetary union was maintained through these years by a coalition of interests and beliefs that was, in retrospect, somewhat fragile. Business interests supported it because they genuinely believed the elimination of exchange rate uncertainty would reduce costs and expand markets. Political leaders supported it because they saw it as a step toward the deeper European integration they had long pursued. The European Commission supported it because it represented an extension of European authority into a domain, monetary policy, that had previously been entirely national. And ordinary citizens, where they supported it at all, supported it largely because they trusted the institutions and leaders who told them it would be beneficial. The doubts were there too, present throughout, sometimes suppressed, and sometimes loudly expressed. Economists continued to debate whether Europe constituted an optimal currency area. Trade unions in some countries worried that the loss of the devaluation option would mean that future economic adjustments would fall entirely on wages and employment, that workers would bear the costs that currencies had previously absorbed. Nationalists across the political spectrum objected to surrendering a symbol of sovereignty as fundamental as the national currency. And a quieter, more diffuse concern existed among ordinary people who had simply never been asked whether they wanted this particular change, who had not been consulted in any meaningful way about whether the convenience of a shared currency was worth the loss of the familiar money they had used their entire lives. These concerns were not unfounded. They would prove, in the years after the euro's launch, to have identified real vulnerabilities that the project's architects had not fully resolved. But in the late 1990s, with the project's momentum strong and the convergence criteria largely being met, the concerns were manageable. The train was moving, and it was moving toward a destination that had been agreed upon and was now approaching. The European Central Bank was established in Frankfurt in June of 1998, its location in Germany a deliberate acknowledgement of the country, whose monetary credibility the new institution would need to inherit. Its first president was Wim Duisenberg, a Dutch economist and central banker, chosen as a compromise between the German preference for a Northern European with Bundesbank-style instincts and French pressure for influence over the institution. The ECB was given a mandate focused above all on price stability, keeping inflation close to but below 2%, language that deliberately echoed the Bundesbank's own mandate and was intended to signal to financial markets that the new institution would be as disciplined as the institution whose credibility it was inheriting. And then, on the 1st of January 1999, 11 European nations locked their exchange rates irrevocably against each other and began the final approach to a single currency. Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Austria, Finland, and Ireland. Greece had not yet met the criteria and would join 2 years later. Britain, Denmark, and Sweden remained outside, each for their own reasons, each maintaining their own currencies and their own monetary policies. The euro, as a currency used in financial markets and accounting, began that day. The coins and notes were still 3 years away. But the essential decision had been made, the essential step had been taken. The exchange rates were fixed. The national currencies, while still physically present, were now simply denominations of the euro, fractions of a larger whole scheduled to disappear. Whether this was wisdom or hubris, prudence or overreach, would take years to fully answer. The question was not yet urgent. The night was quiet. The 1st of January 1999 was cold across much of Europe, as January tends to be. People went about their lives. The currency traders noted the new rates. The financial markets opened and functioned. And somewhere in the background, in ways that were not yet visible to most people, the great experiment had begun. Let that settle for a moment. Let yourself rest in the quiet of that particular January, with its mix of ambition and uncertainty, its combination of genuine achievement and unresolved questions. There is no hurry. The story continues at its own pace, unhurried, unfolding like the slow turning of a continent into something it had never quite been before. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over financial markets in the hours before a storm. Not silence exactly. The trading floors are still busy, the terminal still flickering, the phone still ringing, but a quality of held breath, a sense that the usual noise is papering over something that has not yet been named. Those who have worked in markets long enough learn to recognize it. It is the quiet of a system under pressure that has not yet admitted to itself how much pressure it is under. That quality of held breath describes the European monetary system through much of 1992. We have already travelled through what happened in September of that year: the attack on the pound, the dramatic and failed defence, the withdrawal of Britain and Italy from the exchange rate mechanism. But there is more to understand about that moment and what it revealed, because the crisis of September 1992 was not only a story about currency speculators and central bank reserves. It was a story about the limits of commitment, about what happens when the economic logic of a political decision becomes too costly to sustain, and about the gap between what governments promise and what they can actually deliver. To sit with that gap for a moment is to understand something important about the path from the Maastricht Treaty, signed in February of 1992, to the eventual launch of the euro 7 years later. The path was not straight. It was not smooth. It passed through doubt and crisis and near failure, and it arrived at its destination not because the difficulties were resolved, but because enough people in enough places decided again and again that the destination was worth the difficulties. The Maastricht Treaty had been agreed in December of 1991, and it required ratification by each of the 12 member states of the European Community before it could enter into force. In some countries, this was a parliamentary process. Governments with stable majorities could push ratification through their legislatures without too much difficulty. In others, it required a referendum, a direct vote of the population, an opportunity for ordinary citizens to express their view on a project that had been largely negotiated among elites. Denmark held its referendum on the 2nd of June, 1992. The result was a narrow rejection. 50.7% voted against ratification, 49.3% in favour. It was a difference of fewer than 40,000 votes in a country of 5 million people. By any reasonable measure, the Danish population was almost exactly evenly divided. But in the binary logic of referendums, a narrow loss is still a loss, and the Maastricht Treaty could not enter into force unless every member state ratified it. Denmark's no was a genuine crisis for the project. The political response was rapid and revealing. European leaders did not conclude from Denmark's vote that the project needed to be reconsidered or significantly revised. They concluded that Denmark needed to be offered specific accommodations, opt-outs from particular provisions of the treaty, including the single currency itself, that would allow Danish voters to say yes in a second referendum without those voters feeling that they had reversed their earlier position. This approach of addressing democratic resistance through technical modifications and second votes rather than substantive reconsideration would become a recurring pattern in European integration, and it would generate its own store of resentment and mistrust over the years that followed. France's referendum came in September of 1992, in the same turbulent week as the exchange rate mechanism crisis. The timing was unhelpful. Currency markets were in turmoil. The European monetary system was visibly under stress, and French voters were being asked to endorse a treaty that committed France to eventual monetary union, to giving up the franc, the currency that had been a symbol of French sovereignty for generations, in exchange for a shared European currency managed by an institution in Frankfurt that would not be directly answerable to the French government. The result, as we noted before, was the thinnest of margins in favour: 51% for ratification, 49% against. President Mitterrand had called the referendum partly out of political confidence, expecting a more comfortable victory, and partly out of a genuine belief that democratic endorsement would strengthen the project's legitimacy. Instead, he got a result that demonstrated how fragile that legitimacy actually was. Half of France, rounding generously, did not want what their government had agreed to on their behalf. These referendum results mattered not just as political events, but as signals about the nature of the project being built. European monetary union was being constructed from the top down, by governments, by central bankers, by economists and lawyers and diplomats who genuinely believed in what they were doing and who had in many cases been working toward it for decades. The populations of the countries involved had varying degrees of enthusiasm for it, and in several cases that enthusiasm, when directly tested, proved to be considerably less than their governments had assumed. This democratic deficit, the gap between elite commitment to European integration and popular ambivalence about it, was not a secret. It was discussed openly by academics and journalists and some politicians. But it was not, in the early 1990s, treated as a fundamental obstacle to the project's progress. The assumption, shared by most of those driving the integration forward, was that populations would come to support what they initially doubted once they experienced the benefits. The euro, once it existed, once people were using it and finding it convenient and seeing their economies prosper within it, would generate its own legitimacy. The project needed to be built first and accepted later. Whether this assumption was wise or arrogant, prudent or contemptuous of democratic process, is a question that does not have a simple answer. It was an assumption that proved partly right and partly wrong, in ways that would only become fully clear much later. For now, it is simply worth noting that the euro was built with this assumption at its foundation, that the consent of the governed could follow the fact of the policy, rather than preceding it. Through the rest of 1992 and into 1993, the exchange rate mechanism continued under pressure. In August of 1993, after months of further turbulence, the permitted fluctuation bands within the mechanism were dramatically widened. From the previous narrow range of 2.25% either side of the central rate to 15% either side. This was, in practical terms, very close to allowing currencies to float freely. The mechanism still existed in name, but its constraining power had been largely removed. For the committed advocates of monetary union, this was both a setback and a clarification. It was a setback because it demonstrated again that maintaining fixed exchange rates between sovereign countries with different economic conditions was extraordinarily difficult. It was a clarification because it underlined the essential argument for full monetary union. The only way to permanently eliminate exchange rate uncertainty between European countries was to permanently eliminate exchange rates between them, to merge the currencies into one rather than merely trying to keep them aligned. The project continued, governments continued preparing. The timetable set out in the Maastricht Treaty remained the framework, and gradually, through the mid-1990s, the turbulence in the currency markets subsided, the broader European economies began to recover from the recession of the early 90s, and the path toward the euro became smoother. What changed most visibly during these years was interest rates, as it became increasingly credible that the single currency would actually happen, as governments demonstrated one by one that they were genuinely working to meet the convergence criteria. The interest rates on government bonds across southern Europe began to fall. This convergence in borrowing costs was one of the most remarkable financial phenomena of the 1990s, and it is worth pausing to understand what was happening and why. In the early 1990s, the difference in borrowing costs between Germany and a country like Italy or Spain was very large. Italy, for instance, was paying interest rates of perhaps 12 or 13% on its 10-year government bonds, while Germany was paying perhaps 6 or 7%. This difference, the spread, in financial market language, reflected investors' assessment of the risks involved. Italian government debt was considered riskier than German government debt because Italy had a history of higher inflation, because the lira had periodically been devalued, because Italy's fiscal situation was more complicated, and because there was always some possibility that Italy might default or restructure its debts in ways that German bonds were not expected to do. But as the 1990s progressed, and it became clearer that Italy would join the single currency, investors began to reason that Italian government bonds were becoming less like Italian instruments and more like European ones. If Italy was going to be part of the same currency union as Germany, managed by the same central bank with the same inflation target, then surely Italian bonds were not so much riskier than German ones. Surely the spread should narrow, and so investors began buying Italian bonds, and Spanish bonds, and Portuguese bonds, and Irish bonds, driving up their prices and pushing down their yields, until by the late 1990s the differences in borrowing costs between Eurozone member states had shrunk to almost nothing. This convergence was, in the short term, genuinely beneficial for the countries experiencing it. Lower borrowing costs meant governments could service their debts more cheaply, freeing up money for other purposes, lower interest rates flowed through to businesses and households, making investment and borrowing cheaper. The prospect of euro membership, and then membership itself, delivered a real economic dividend in the form of dramatically reduced financing costs. It was one of the clearest and most immediate benefits of the project. What was less visible at the time, what would only become apparent much later, in a different and more difficult period, was that this convergence in borrowing costs was not entirely a reflection of genuine convergence in economic conditions. It was partly a bet on the future, an anticipation of a degree of risk-sharing and mutual support within the Eurozone that had not actually been agreed upon and might never be. Investors were assuming that Eurozone membership conferred a kind of implicit guarantee that Germany and other strong economies would not allow a fellow member to default, that the shared currency created a shared responsibility for each member's debts. This assumption was not written into any treaty. It was not the official position of any European government. But it was embedded in the price of bonds across southern Europe, and the consequences of that embedding would eventually have to be reckoned with. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, travelling too quickly toward a destination that is still some distance away. Let us return to the years of construction, to the patient, detailed, sometimes contentious work of actually building the institutions and mechanisms that the euro would require. The European Central Bank opened its doors in Frankfurt in June of 1998, inheriting the building and some of the staff of its predecessor institution, the European Monetary Institute, which had been doing the preparatory work for several years. The choice of Frankfurt was symbolically important. It placed the new institution in Germany, in the country whose monetary credibility it most needed to inherit, in the city where the Bundesbank had its headquarters. It was a message to financial markets and to the German public. This new institution would be German in its instincts, even if it was European in its governance. The ECB's structure reflected the political compromises that had been necessary to bring it into existence. Its governing council included representatives from each member country's national central bank, alongside an executive board based in Frankfurt. Decisions were made by majority vote, but with the national central bankers, who continued to run their country's day-to-day monetary operations, holding substantial influence. This meant that the ECB was, in a sense, both a single institution and a network of national institutions, which would sometimes create tensions between the European perspective and the national ones that the governors inevitably brought with them. The first president of the ECB, Wim Duisenberg, was a compromise candidate in ways that were never quite hidden. France had wanted its own candidate, Jean-Claude Trichet, the governor of the Banque de France, installed from the start. Germany had wanted Duisenberg, a Dutchman with impeccably Bundesbank-like instincts toward price stability. The compromise reached, in a manner that somewhat undermined the principle of central bank independence, even before the bank had opened, was that Duisenberg would serve but would step down before the end of his full term, at which point Trichet would take over. The agreement was never officially acknowledged. Duisenberg himself said publicly that he would decide for himself when to retire. But it was widely understood, and it said something about the tension between the principle of technocratic independence and the political realities of building a shared institution among sovereign states. These negotiations and compromises, taking place in the years between Maastricht and the euro's launch, had a quality of patient, detailed work that rarely makes dramatic history, but matters enormously in practice. The conversion rates at which each national currency would be permanently fixed to the euro had to be determined, not just technically, but politically, because the rate at which, say, the Italian lira was converted into euros would affect the competitiveness of Italian industry for years to come. Set it too high, and Italian exports would be overpriced. Set it too low, and Italian consumers would find imports expensive. The negotiations over conversion rates were careful, and for the most part, conducted without the sharp conflicts that might have been expected. The physical design of the euro banknotes and coins required decisions that were surprisingly freighted with meaning. The notes, designed by an Austrian graphic designer named Robert Kalina following a competition, depicted architectural styles from different periods of European history, a window and gateway for each denomination, suggesting openness and connection between peoples. The deliberate choice was to show generic architectural forms rather than specific buildings, to avoid any note featuring a structure that could be identified with one particular nation rather than Europe as a whole. Bridges appeared on the reverses, bridges as metaphors for connection, for crossing the divisions that had separated Europeans for so long. The coins were handled differently, with each member country permitted to design its own national side, while the common side showed a map of Europe. This meant that a €1 coin minted in France would look different from one minted in Germany or Spain or Finland, but all would be legal tender throughout the Eurozone. You could accumulate coins from many different countries in your pocket, a small physical reminder that the money passing through your hands had travelled through many different places, many different economies, many different histories, and yet was all the same currency, all the same value, all part of the same shared project. There was a tenderness for many people in the disappearance of the old currencies. The Deutsche Mark in particular carried an emotional weight that was difficult to exaggerate. For West Germans who had grown up in the post-war decades, the mark was not just money. It was the currency of reconstruction, the currency that had replaced the worthless Reichsmark after the catastrophic inflation of the post-war years, the currency that had accompanied every good thing about modern Germany's economic story. Opinion polls in Germany through the 1990s consistently showed that a majority of Germans were reluctant to give up the mark, that they were more sceptical of the euro than their government's enthusiasm might have suggested. Helmut Kohl, who had committed Germany to monetary union as part of the grand bargain around reunification, understood this reluctance and chose to address it not through a referendum — there was no referendum on the euro in Germany — but through reassurance, the repeated insistence that the euro would be as stable as the mark, that the ECB would be as disciplined as the Bundesbank, that Germans were not sacrificing their monetary security but extending it, sharing it with their neighbours, building something larger and more durable than any national currency could be. Whether this reassurance was entirely honest or somewhat optimistic is, again, a question that the subsequent years would test. The French franc, the Italian lira, the Spanish peseta, the Dutch guilder, the Irish pound, each of these currencies carried its own history, its own associations, its own place in the national imagination. The franc dated back to the 14th century in various forms. The lira had roots in the monetary systems of the medieval Italian city-states. These were not just financial instruments, they were cultural artifacts, objects that people handled daily, that connected them to the history of their countries. When they disappeared, something real was lost, even if what replaced them was in many measurable ways more convenient. The changeover to physical euro notes and coins, when it finally happened on the 1st of January 2002, required a logistical operation of extraordinary scale. 14.5 billion banknotes and 50.2 billion coins had to be produced, distributed to banks and businesses across 12 countries, and introduced into circulation while the old national currencies were simultaneously withdrawn. Shops had to reprice their goods. Cash registers had to be reprogrammed. Millions of people had to learn to think in a new unit of account, to recalibrate their intuitions about what things cost, to stop automatically converting prices back into marks or francs, or layer to check whether they were being overcharged. The conversion process went by and large remarkably smoothly. There were complaints, particularly in some countries where businesses took the opportunity to round prices upward when converting from the old currency, so that consumers felt goods had become subtly more expensive. This perception of a euro-driven price increases became known in Germany as the Turo effect, a pun combining Teuer, the German word for expensive, with euro, and it contributed to ongoing skepticism about the currency among ordinary Germans, even as official statistics suggested actual inflation was low. But the logistics worked. The cash machines were refilled, the shops repriced. The old notes and coins flowed back into the banking system and were withdrawn from circulation. Within a few weeks, the currencies that had defined European economic life for generations were gone, replaced by something new, something shared, something that had not existed before and that hundreds of millions of people were now using for the first time. It was, whatever one thought of the economics, a remarkable human achievement. Not the work of any single person or government, but the accumulated result of decades of negotiation, compromise, institution building, political will, and, let us be honest, a considerable amount of good fortune and favourable timing. The men and women who had dreamed of it in the rubble of 1945, who had begun building toward it in the 1950s, who had argued for it through the crises of the 1970s and 80s, did not all live to see it. but enough of them did. Jean Monnet had died in 1979 before the euro was more than a distant aspiration. Helmut Kohl saw it arrive, though he had left office in 1998 after a remarkable 16 years as Chancellor. Wim Duisenberg presided over its launch as ECB president. François Mitterrand had died in 1996 before the notes and coins appeared, but after the treaty that made them possible, these were the architects. But the currency belonged, in the end, to the hundreds of millions of ordinary people who picked up the new coins, unfolded the new notes, and went about the business of their ordinary lives, buying bread, paying for fuel, settling accounts, saving for the future, in a currency that connected them, whether they thought about it or not, to their neighbours in ways that nothing before had quite managed. Rest with that image for a moment, a continent of people reaching into their pockets and finding the same money. It is a small thing and an enormous thing simultaneously, like most of the changes that actually matter in human history. The morning of January 1st, 2002 was cold across much of Europe, ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, as the best mornings tend to be. There is something quietly wonderful about the moment when an abstract idea becomes a physical object you can hold in your hand. For years, the euro had existed as a treaty commitment, as a convergence target, as a set of criteria to be met and rules to be followed, as a project discussed in conference rooms and central bank boardrooms and academic papers. It had a name and a symbol, that distinctive double-striped letter that began appearing on documents and signs and financial statements through the late 1990s. But it did not yet have weight. It did not yet have texture. It did not yet make the particular sound that coins make when they fall against each other in a pocket or settle into a till. And then, on the 1st of January 2002, it did. But before we arrive at that morning, the cash machines refilled overnight, the shopkeepers updating their price tags, the first bleary-eyed customers of the new year reaching for unfamiliar notes, we need to spend some time with the 3 years that preceded it. Because between January of 1999, when the euro began its life as an accounting currency, and January of 2002, when it became physical money, a great deal of quiet, consequential work was taking place, and understanding that work helps us appreciate both the scale of what was achieved and the nature of what remained unfinished. The euro's existence as an accounting currency from 1999 onward was genuinely significant even without physical notes and coins. Financial markets, which operate largely through electronic transfers and recorded obligations rather than physical cash, immediately began conducting transactions in euros. Governments issued bonds denominated in euros. Banks settled their accounts with each other in euros. The foreign exchange market, the vast, continuous global market in which currencies are bought and sold, began quoting the euro against the dollar, the yen, the pound, and other currencies. The euro was real in every sense that mattered to the financial system, even if the person buying vegetables at a market in Madrid or Milan was still paying in pesetas or lire. For businesses operating across the eurozone, the 3-year transition period was enormously useful. It gave them time to adapt their accounting systems, their pricing strategies, their contracts. A company that had been invoicing customers in Deutsche Marks could begin invoicing in euros, knowing that the conversion rate was irrevocably fixed. 1 euro equaled 1 mark and 95.83 pfennigs, a rate that would never change, that was written into law and could not be altered by any market movement or government decision. The uncertainty that had plagued cross-border business for decades, the possibility that the exchange rate might shift between the signing of a contract and the receipt of payment, was gone. Permanently, irreversibly gone, at least within the eurozone. This permanence was the euro's most important economic gift to the businesses and governments that used it, and it is worth dwelling on what permanence meant in this context. Exchange rates between floating currencies move constantly. They respond to economic data, to political events, to the shifting expectations of millions of traders making millions of individual assessments about relative economic conditions. A business planning an investment that would take 5 years to pay off could not know, in a world of floating exchange rates, what the relevant exchange rates would be in year 3 or year 4 or year 5. It could try to hedge against this uncertainty using financial instruments, forward contracts, options, but hedging has costs, and even sophisticated hedging strategies cannot eliminate uncertainty entirely over long time horizons. With the euro's irrevocable fixing of conversion rates in 1999, this uncertainty within the eurozone simply ceased to exist. A German manufacturer selling to a French customer, a Spanish bank lending to an Irish developer, a Dutch pension fund investing in Italian government bonds, all of these transactions became in the relevant dimension as simple and certain as domestic transactions. The exchange rate would not move, the currency would not be devalued, the calculation that had always had to include a risk premium for exchange rate volatility could now be made without it. The European Central Bank, operating from its headquarters in Frankfurt's Euro Tower, a 36-floor glass and steel building that had previously housed the offices of a retail company, began the practical work of conducting monetary policy for the entire Eurozone. This was, from the first day, an exercise in navigating heterogeneity. The 11 economies that had adopted the euro on the 1st of January 1999 were similar in some important ways and quite different in others. They shared a commitment to the European project and had all met, or come close enough to meeting, the Maastricht convergence criteria, but they had different industrial structures, different labour market institutions, different banking systems, different traditions of wage negotiation, different rates of productivity growth, different demographic trajectories. The ECB's task was to set a single interest rate, or more precisely a small family of interest rates, that would be appropriate for all of these economies simultaneously. In practice, this meant setting a rate appropriate for the Eurozone as a whole, taking a kind of weighted average of economic conditions across all member states. In the early years, this translated into interest rates that were, by historical standards, quite low. Lower than several southern European countries had been accustomed to, lower than their domestic economic conditions, viewed in isolation, might have warranted. For Ireland in particular, the arrival of the euro brought interest rates that were strikingly, almost dizzyingly low by historical standards. Through the 1980s and much of the 1990s, Ireland had paid substantial premiums to borrow money, its interest rates elevated by the uncertainty that surrounded the Irish pound, and by the memory of the fiscal difficulties Ireland had experienced in the 1980s. Now, as a Eurozone member, Ireland borrowed at rates close to those Germany paid. The effect on an economy that was already growing rapidly, the Celtic Tiger's roar had begun in the early 1990s, driven by foreign direct investment, a young and well-educated workforce and favourable tax policies, was to pour additional fuel onto a fire that was already burning hot. Credit became cheap and abundant. Irish banks, borrowing in euros at low rates, lent eagerly to Irish businesses and households. Property prices, already rising, began to rise faster. Construction activity accelerated. The Irish economy grew at rates that seemed, to those watching from outside, almost miraculous, and that seemed to many of those inside like confirmation that Ireland had finally found its place in the world, that the long history of poverty and emigration was over, that prosperity was now a permanent condition rather than a temporary exception. Spain experienced something similar. Low interest rates flowing from ECB monetary policy met an economy with strong underlying growth, a booming tourism sector, and a population that had spent decades dreaming of the kind of prosperity that Northern Europeans took for granted. Credit flowed freely. A construction boom began that would eventually leave Spain with more unsold apartments than any comparable country in Europe. House prices rose year after year. Unemployment fell. The Spanish economy grew steadily through the early 2000s, and Spain seemed to many observers to be one of the clearest success stories of Euro membership, a country that had used the stability and credibility conferred by the single currency to fund a genuine transformation of its economic base. Portugal grew more slowly, its economy less dynamic than Spain's or Ireland's, its structural challenges more deeply rooted. But it too benefited from the lower borrowing costs that Euro membership brought. The Portuguese government and Portuguese businesses could borrow more cheaply than before. Investment increased. The standard of living, measured by the goods and services available to ordinary Portuguese people, continued to improve through the early years of the century. Even Greece, which joined the Eurozone on the 1st of January 2001, 2 years after the original 11, experienced the credit-driven optimism of the early Euro years. Greece had not been among the original members, partly because its fiscal situation, and its statistical reporting of that situation, had not met the required standards. It was admitted in 2001 on the basis of reported figures that would later prove to have been significantly understated. but in the moment of accession, the mood was celebratory. Greece, the cradle of European civilization, the country whose philosophers and mathematicians and artists had given so much to the culture that Europe called its inheritance, was joining the modern European project in its fullest form. It seemed right. It seemed fitting. The difficulties lay ahead, still invisible. Meanwhile, in the northern and central parts of the Eurozone, the experience of the early Euro years was rather different. Germany, which had given up its beloved Deutsche Mark and committed to the shared project with the full weight of Helmut Kohl's political authority, found itself in a period of unexpected economic difficulty through the early 2000s. The costs of reunification, still being absorbed a decade after the wall came down, continued to weigh on the German fiscal position. German wages, which had risen during the reunification boom of the early 1990s, were now high relative to Germany's European competitors. German exports, while still strong, faced increasing competitive pressure. Unemployment in Germany was stubbornly elevated through the early 2000s, reaching levels that were genuinely alarming for a country that prided itself on its economic management. The German response to this difficulty was not to ask the ECB for lower interest rates. It understood that monetary policy was set for the whole Eurozone, not for Germany alone. Instead, Germany undertook a sustained program of domestic adjustment. Under Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, beginning in 2003, Germany implemented a series of labour market reforms that became known as the Hartz reforms, after the consultant who chaired the commission that designed them. These reforms made it easier for businesses to hire and fire workers, reduced the generosity of unemployment benefits, and created new categories of low-wage employment that had not previously existed in the German system. The reforms were painful and politically costly. They contributed to Schröder's eventual electoral defeat. But they worked, in the sense that they gradually reduced German labour costs relative to Germany's competitors and restored German export competitiveness. The divergence that was quietly building through these early Euro years, southern European economies running on cheap credit and rising wages and prices, while Germany kept wages and costs restrained and rebuilt its competitive position, was not invisible to economists who looked carefully at the data. The current account imbalances within the Eurozone were growing. Germany was running an increasing surplus, meaning it was exporting more than it imported and accumulating claims on the rest of the world. Southern European countries were running deficits, meaning they were importing more than they exported and borrowing from abroad, increasingly from German and other Northern European banks, to finance the difference. In a world of separate national currencies, these imbalances would have generated pressure on exchange rates. The countries running deficits would have seen their currencies weaken, making their exports cheaper and their imports more expensive, naturally correcting the imbalance over time. But inside the Eurozone, this adjustment mechanism did not exist. There were no separate exchange rates to move. The imbalances could persist as long as the financing continued, as long as investors and banks were willing to keep lending to southern European governments and economies at low rates. And through the early 2000s, that willingness showed no sign of diminishing. Quite the opposite. It would be wrong to leave the early years of the euro as a story told only in macroeconomic terms, in interest rates and current account balances and competitive divergences. Because for the hundreds of millions of people living through those years, the experience was mostly ordinary life conducted with a new kind of money. And the experience of the money itself, of the physical euro, was something that deserves its own quiet attention. The notes that appeared in wallets and tills across 12 countries in January of 2002 had a particular aesthetic quality, clean, modern, somewhat abstract, designed to belong to Europe rather than to any single nation. The €5 note showed a classical arch. The €10 note depicted a Romanesque bridge. The €20 note featured Gothic windows. The €50 note carried a Renaissance facade. The €100 note showed Baroque architecture. The €200 note displayed the iron and glass structures of the 19th century. And the €500 note, a denomination that seemed almost theoretical in everyday transactions, featured the glass and steel architecture of the modern era. These images were invented, not photographed. They were generic representations of architectural styles, specifically designed to ensure that no real building from any specific country appeared on the notes. A French person would not see a French building. A German would not see a German one. The notes belonged to no particular place and therefore in theory to every place. It was an elegant solution to an impossible problem: how to create a visual identity for a currency that needed to represent 25 million square kilometers of varied landscape, 3,000 years of tangled history, and the deeply particular national pride of a dozen different peoples simultaneously. The coins solved the problem differently. Each member state designed its own national face for each denomination, while sharing a common European face. The result was a quiet, pocketful democracy of design. Carry change in your pocket in Paris or Madrid or Amsterdam, and you might find a Finnish coin bearing a swooping swan, a Greek coin showing an ancient Athenian owl, an Irish coin carrying a harp, a Portuguese coin depicting a medieval seal, a German coin featuring the Brandenburg Gate, or a spread eagle. Each of these coins was worth exactly the same as every other coin of its denomination. Each was legal tender everywhere the euro was used, and each carried, on its national face, a small piece of the particular history and identity that its country of origin had brought to the shared project. There were countries that chose to remain outside this shared project, and their reasons illuminate what the euro meant by contrast. Britain's decision not to join was the most consequential, given the size and depth of its financial sector and its long history as one of Europe's major economic powers. The British debate about euro membership was complicated, long-running, and ultimately resolved, for the period we are considering at least, in favour of staying out. The economic arguments were genuinely balanced. The elimination of exchange rate uncertainty with Britain's largest trading partners was a real benefit, but giving up the ability to set its own interest rates was a real cost. And Britain's economy had characteristics, in particular its housing market's sensitivity to interest rates and its close financial integration with the United States, that made a single European interest rate potentially unsuitable. But the decision was not only economic, it was also deeply cultural and political, rooted in a British relationship with European institutions that had always been more ambivalent than that of the founding members, more sceptical of the integrationist project, more attached to particular notions of sovereignty that made sharing a central bank feel categorically different from sharing a trade agreement. Britain joined the exchange rate mechanism in 1990, was humiliated out of it in September of 1992, and the scar of that experience made any future commitment to locking sterling to European monetary policy feel politically impossible for years afterward. Sweden held a referendum on euro membership in September of 2003, after the country had already been part of the European Union for 8 years. The result was a clear rejection, 56% against, 42% in favour. The campaign had been marked by tragedy. Anna Lindh, Sweden's foreign minister and a prominent advocate for euro membership, was stabbed while shopping in a Stockholm department store 2 days before the vote and died the following day. Her death cast a shadow over the campaign's final days, but it did not change the fundamental dynamics of Swedish public opinion, which had been sceptical of euro membership throughout. Sweden, like Denmark before it, concluded that the benefits of staying out, retaining the krona, retaining the Riksbank's ability to set interest rates for Swedish conditions, outweighed the benefits of joining. And unlike Denmark, which had a formal opt-out written into its treaty arrangements, Sweden simply declined to meet the formal requirement of exchange rate mechanism membership before joining the euro, a technical non-compliance that Brussels chose not to challenge. The countries that stayed out, Britain, Denmark, Sweden, were not in those early years of the euro obviously suffering from their decision. The euro's early years were not without turbulence. The currency had launched at a value close to $1.20 against the United States dollar, but had fallen steadily through 1999 and 2000, reaching a low of around 83 cents in October of 2000, a decline that surprised and somewhat embarrassed the ECB and the European governments that had expected the new currency to be strong. The fall reflected in part the extraordinary performance of the American economy through those years, the technology boom that was drawing investment dollars to United States assets, but it also reflected some genuine uncertainty about the new currency and the institution managing it. The euro recovered through 2002 and 2003, rising steadily against the dollar as the American technology bubble deflated and as investors found reasons to favour European assets. By 2004, the euro had risen well above its launch level, trading at rates significantly above parity with the dollar, a recovery that the ECB could point to as confirmation of the currency's fundamental soundness. Through the first years of the euro's physical existence, life across the eurozone continued in its ordinary rhythms. People used the new money. They stopped thinking about conversion rates between the old national currencies and the euro. A generation of children grew up knowing only the euro, unable to imagine having to exchange money at a booth when crossing from Germany into France. The currency became, as currencies do, simply the background condition of economic life, unremarkable, taken for granted, invisible in the way that only the things we depend on completely can be invisible. And beneath this ordinary life, beneath the quotidian reality of notes and coins, changing hands in markets and cafes and petrol stations across the continent, the structural tensions continued to build, quietly, patiently, in the way that pressures build when they have nowhere to go, accumulating potential that will eventually need to be released. The architecture of the eurozone, its monetary union without fiscal union, its shared currency without shared debt, its single central bank without a single treasury, was not well designed for absorbing the stresses that economic divergence would eventually generate. But the architects had known this, or some of them had. They had built what they could build, given the political constraints of the time. They had hoped that the union would deepen as it matured, that the political will to complete the architecture would follow the economic logic that demanded completion. Whether that hope was well-founded remained, at the end of the euro's first decade, very much an open question. The lights across Europe were still burning. The coins were still changing hands. The great experiment was still underway, still generating its ordinary daily evidence of what was possible when old divisions are set aside and something new is built in their place. That evidence was real, and it mattered, and it deserves to be held alongside everything that came later. The early years of the euro were not simply a prelude to crisis. They were years of genuine achievement, of real improvement in real lives, of a currency working largely as intended for the hundreds of millions of people who used it every day without drama or difficulty. It is enough for now to rest in that. To let the image of those ordinary mornings settle, the baker in Lyon making change in euros, the farmer in Andalusia checking the price of his olives in euros, the student in Dublin paying her rent in euros, the pensioner in Lisbon counting out coins that connected him, without his ever needing to think about it, to tens of millions of strangers across a continent that had chosen, against long odds and with imperfect tools, to share something as intimate as money. Let that image carry you gently forward, or gently into sleep. Either is welcome here. The story will continue when you're ready. The ordinary, it turns out, is where most of history actually happens. Not in the dramatic moments, the treaty signings, the referendum nights, the currency crises, but in the accumulated weight of daily transactions, daily decisions, daily lives lived within systems that shape behaviour in ways their inhabitants rarely stop to examine. The euro, once it became the background condition of economic life across 12 countries, began doing what currencies do when they work. It made certain things easier, encouraged certain behaviours, created certain incentives, and, less visibly, less immediately, made other adjustments harder, closed off certain options, removed certain safety valves that people had not known they would miss until the moment they needed them. To understand what the euro years looked like from the inside, it helps to sit with a specific place and a specific time. Let us sit for a moment with Ireland in the years between 2000 and 2007. Not the Ireland of tourist brochures or literary mythology, though those islands were present too, but the island of construction cranes and rising house prices and young people buying their first apartments with mortgages that seemed entirely manageable given how rapidly everything was appreciating. The island of a country that had spent most of its history poor, that had watched its young people emigrate for generations, that had finally, astonishingly, become a place people moved to rather than fled from. The Celtic tiger had begun roaring before the euro arrived. Through the 1990s, Ireland had grown at rates that made economists reconsider their assumptions about what small, open economies at the edge of Europe could achieve. Foreign direct investment, particularly from American technology companies attracted by Ireland's low corporate tax rate, its English-speaking workforce, and its membership of the European single market, had transformed what had been an agricultural economy into something that looked, from certain angles, like a European version of the East Asian economic miracles. Intel and Dell and Microsoft and Pfizer built facilities in Ireland. Young graduates found work in sectors that had barely existed a decade earlier. Dublin began to feel, tentatively at first and then with increasing confidence, like a genuinely European capital rather than a provincial backwater. Then the euro arrived, and with it interest rates that were set for the average conditions of the eurozone rather than for the specific, overheating conditions of the Irish economy. The ECB's rate through the early 2000s was broadly appropriate for Germany, which was struggling, and for France, which was growing slowly, and for several other economies that were performing at or below their long-run potential. It was not appropriate for Ireland, which was growing well above its potential, and where cheap credit was the last thing a property market already stretched by strong demand actually needed. But the ECB did not set rates for Ireland alone. It could not. That was the nature of the arrangement Ireland had chosen. Irish banks, operating in this environment of abundant cheap credit, did what banks do when money is cheap and optimism is high. They lent. They lent to property developers who were building apartments and houses and office blocks at a pace that seemed, in the moment, to be barely keeping up with demand. They lent to households who were buying those properties at prices that required ever larger mortgages, but that seemed rational given how reliably prices had risen for a decade. They borrowed in the wholesale funding markets, taking short-term loans from other European banks, largely German and French and British ones, and using those funds to make long-term loans to Irish borrowers. This practice, known as maturity transformation, is normal banking. But the scale at which Irish banks were doing it, and the concentration of the loans they were making in a single sector of a single small economy, was anything but normal. The numbers, looked at afterward, are striking in their clarity. Irish house prices roughly tripled between the mid-1990s and their peak in 2007. The construction sector, at the height of the boom, accounted for around a quarter of Irish economic output, a proportion more reminiscent of a developing economy building its basic infrastructure than of a mature European economy. Irish banks' loan books grew at rates that far exceeded the growth of the underlying economy they were supposed to be serving. The ratio of private sector debt to gross domestic product reached levels that should, and did among those who were paying close attention, cause serious concern. But in the moment, it was very difficult for any individual participant in the Irish economy to step back and see the system whole. The developer building apartments was responding rationally to what appeared to be genuine demand. The bank lending to that developer was making decisions that looked defensible, given the track record of Irish property. The household buying the apartment was doing what seemed prudent, getting onto the property ladder before prices rose further. The regulator watching over the banking system was operating within a framework that trusted markets to price risk correctly, and did not look too hard at the aggregate picture that individual institutions' balance sheets. Taken together were painting. Each tree looked fine, the forest was on fire. Spain's experience through these years had its own specific character, different in detail from Ireland's but similar in its essential dynamics. Spain in the 2000s was a country in the middle of a genuinely impressive economic transformation, building its infrastructure, expanding its cities, integrating fully into European economic life after decades of isolation under Franco, and then the careful, successful transition to democracy. The construction boom that low interest rates and abundant credit financed in Spain was enormous, even by the standards of a large economy. At the peak of the building frenzy, Spain was constructing more new housing units each year than Germany, France, and Britain combined, 3 countries with substantially larger populations and collectively far greater housing needs. The Spanish property boom created real wealth for those who owned property and real employment for those who built it. But it also created vulnerabilities that were not visible while the financing continued to flow. Spanish banks, like Irish ones, were borrowing in wholesale markets to fund long-term property loans. The Spanish current account deficit, the gap between what Spain spent and what it earned from the rest of the world, widened steadily, financed by borrowing from northern European creditors who were themselves awash with the savings that Germany's export surpluses were generating. The circuit was elegant in its way. German workers kept wages modest and produced goods that the world wanted to buy. German companies earned those export revenues. German banks, flush with funds, lent to Spanish and Irish banks. those banks lent to Spanish and Irish property buyers, and the property buyers' spending created the demand that kept the boom going. For as long as the circuit held, everyone could tell themselves a story about it that made sense. German banks were earning returns on funds that might otherwise have sat idle. Spanish and Irish banks were profitably intermediating between savers and borrowers. Households were building wealth in property. Economies were growing. The euro, facilitating all of this cross-border financing by eliminating exchange rate risk, was working as intended. Portugal, growing more slowly and less dramatically than Spain or Ireland, nonetheless shared in the dynamics of cheap credit and capital inflows from the north. Greek growth through the early 2000s was strong by European standards, supported by a combination of European structural funds, cheap borrowing, and a government willing to spend freely on public sector wages and social programs that kept the domestic economy running warm. The Athens Olympics of 2004 were a moment of genuine national pride, a demonstration that Greece could organise and execute something of global scale. The cost of those games was substantial, but in an environment where borrowing was cheap and growth was strong, the cost seemed manageable. What was happening in the background of all this growth, the structural divergence between North and South that we touched on in the previous chapter, was real and measurable for those who looked at the right indicators. Unit labour costs, which measure what it costs to produce a given unit of output when wages are taken into account, were rising steadily in southern European economies through the 2000s. They were rising much more slowly in Germany, where the Hartz labour market reforms were doing their work of restraining wage growth and improving productivity. The result was a growing gap in competitive positions. German goods were becoming relatively cheaper compared to Spanish or Greek or Portuguese goods, even within a currency union that eliminated the exchange rate mechanism that would normally have corrected such divergences. This divergence showed up in trade and current account data. But current account data is not the kind of thing that appears on the front pages of newspapers or drives political debate in good times. Economists noted it. Some wrote papers about it. A few sounded alarms in terms that were more urgent. But the political and market consensus through the mid-2000s was broadly optimistic. The Eurozone was growing. Unemployment across the area was falling. The euro itself, having recovered from its early weakness, was a strong and credible currency. The architecture might be incomplete, but it seemed to be working. The countries that had stayed out, Britain, Sweden, Denmark, watched the Eurozone's growth years with varying mixtures of equanimity and occasional second-guessing. Britain under Tony Blair had come close to joining, with Blair personally convinced that membership was in Britain's long-term interest, but unable to persuade his Chancellor, Gordon Brown, who had set out 5 economic tests that he determined had not been met. The tests were not entirely a fig leaf. There were genuine economic arguments for staying out, and the asymmetry between Britain's housing market and those of continental Europe was a real concern. But they were also, in political terms, a mechanism for deferring a decision that was domestically difficult. Britain's economy through the early and mid-2000s performed well outside the euro, which made the case for joining progressively harder to make. The moment, if there had been one, gradually passed. Sweden's referendum result in 2003 settled the question for years. Denmark's opt-out remained in place, confirmed periodically by a population that consistently, when polled, preferred to keep the krone. These decisions meant that the Eurozone was a large but not universal club within the European Union, a distinction that would become more significant as the pressures of the financial crisis began to reveal the different situations of members and non-members. The financial crisis that began in the United States in 2007 and deepened catastrophically through 2008 arrived in Europe with a force that was initially underestimated. The American subprime mortgage market, which had generated an enormous quantity of complex financial instruments backed by home loans made to borrowers who could not reliably service them, had distributed those instruments through the global financial system in ways that were opaque even to many of the institutions that held them. European banks, German, French, British, Swiss, had bought substantial quantities of these instruments, attracted by yields that seemed attractive relative to their apparent safety. When the American housing market turned and the value of those instruments collapsed, European banks found themselves holding losses they had not anticipated and could not always quantify. The immediate consequence was a freezing of the interbank lending market, the market in which banks lend to each other on a short-term basis to manage their liquidity needs. Banks that had been borrowing freely in this market to fund their lending suddenly found that their counterparties were unwilling to lend, uncertain about who was holding how much of the toxic American assets, and therefore uncertain about who could be trusted. The credit that had flowed so freely through the European financial system through the boom years suddenly stopped flowing. For the Irish and Spanish banks that had been funding their property loan books through wholesale borrowing, this sudden stop in credit availability was immediately dangerous. The business model that had made sense when wholesale funding was cheap and reliable became precarious the moment that funding dried up. Irish banks found themselves unable to roll over short-term borrowings that were supporting long-term assets. The classic liquidity crisis, the same basic mechanism that had brought down banks in every financial crisis since banking was invented. The European Central Bank responded to the immediate credit freeze with measures designed to ensure that solvent banks could continue to fund themselves, providing liquidity to the banking system at terms designed to prevent a freezing of credit from becoming a collapse of the financial system. These measures were necessary and, in the short term, effective at preventing the worst immediate outcomes. But they could not address the deeper problem that the crisis was beginning to expose: the debts that had been accumulated during the boom years, the property loans on bank balance sheets, the sovereign debts of governments that had borrowed freely when rates were low, the private sector debts of households and businesses that had expanded their borrowing on the assumption that good times would continue. These were real obligations that would need to be honoured or restructured. The credit freeze had not created these obligations. It had simply made them visible by removing the flow of new credit that had allowed them to be serviced without too much difficulty. Ireland's government, confronted with a banking system that was visibly insolvent given the scale of its property loan losses, made a fateful decision in September of 2008, the same month that Lehman Brothers collapsed in New York, sending shockwaves through the global financial system. The Irish government issued a blanket guarantee of almost all the liabilities of the Irish banking system. It guaranteed deposits, certainly, and that was defensible, necessary to prevent a bank run, but it also guaranteed the bonds that Irish banks had issued to their wholesale lenders, the senior unsecured creditors who had funded the lending boom and who were, in the normal logic of financial markets, expected to bear losses if the institutions they had lent turned out to be insolvent. This guarantee was enormously consequential. It transferred the losses of the Irish banking system from the creditors who had funded those losses to the Irish taxpayer. It was motivated partly by a genuine fear that allowing Irish banks to default on their senior bonds would set off a financial contagion across Europe. Many of those bonds were held by German and French and British banks that were already fragile. It was motivated partly by a failure to fully appreciate, in those chaotic September days, the scale of the losses that were actually embedded in Irish bank loan books. And it was motivated partly by political instincts that prioritised protecting the system over distributing costs fairly. The guarantee would ultimately cost Ireland a very great deal. But in September of 2008, the full cost was not yet known. What was known was that the world had changed, that the credit-fueled optimism of the boom years was over, that the vulnerabilities that had been building quietly beneath the surface of the Eurozone's early success were about to demand attention that could no longer be deferred. The morning after the guarantee, and in the many mornings that followed through the rest of 2008 and into 2009, life across the Eurozone continued in its ordinary rhythms. People went to work, shops opened, the euro remained in pockets and tills from Helsinki to Lisbon. The currency itself was not in question, not yet. But the architecture that had been built to support it, the assumptions about risk, the models of lending and borrowing, the faith that property prices moved in only one direction, all of this was being quietly dismantled piece by piece by the cold logic of a financial system coming to terms with the distance between what had been promised and what could actually be delivered. Something was ending, something that would be harder and more consequential than anyone had yet fully admitted was about to begin. The coins were still in the pockets, the notes were still in the tills. But the world in which they had been so freely spent was already irreversibly gone. Let that land gently without alarm. All of this has already happened. All of it is already behind us. You can let the weight of it settle and then release. The way that any difficult thing eventually settles and releases when enough time has passed and enough distance has accumulated. Breathe slowly. The story continues, and it does not end in catastrophe. But it passes through difficulty first, as most worthwhile stories do. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a long period of noise. Not peaceful exactly, more like the ringing absence that remains after something loud has stopped, when the ears are still adjusting, still waiting to understand what the quiet means. The Eurozone in 2009 had that quality. The noise of the boom years, the construction, the lending, the rising prices, the confident declarations that a new era of European prosperity had arrived, had stopped. And in the silence that followed, things became visible that the noise had been covering. The first and most important thing that became visible was the true state of Greece's public finances. Greece had been a member of the Eurozone since 2001, joining 2 years after the original 11, on the basis of economic data that showed its deficit and debt levels meeting, or coming close enough to meeting, the Maastricht criteria. There had been doubts at the time. Some economists had noted that Greek statistics were not always the most reliable, that the reported figures deserved scrutiny. But the political momentum of enlargement was strong, and Greece was admitted. In 2004, after Athens had hosted the Olympics, the Greek government revised its fiscal data and acknowledged that the deficit figures reported in the years leading up to euro accession had been understated. The revision caused concern but not crisis. The figures were corrected, some adjustments were made, and the matter was treated as a statistical problem rather than a fundamental one. What became clear in 2009 was that the problem was rather more fundamental than that. The new Greek government that came to power in October of 2009, led by George Papandreou, reviewed the public finances it had inherited and found them in a condition considerably worse than the previous government had reported. The budget deficit for 2009 was not the figure that had been forecast. It was closer to 12.5% of gross domestic product, more than 4 times the Maastricht limit, and far beyond anything that Greece's European partners had been led to expect. The revelation was not just a fiscal shock, it was a credibility shock. If Greek statistics could not be trusted, then the entire framework of oversight and reporting on which the Eurozone's fiscal rules rested was revealed to be considerably weaker than it appeared. The Maastricht convergence criteria, the Stability and Growth Pact that was supposed to enforce fiscal discipline after countries joined the euro, the system of peer review and mutual surveillance that was meant to catch problems before they became crises, all of these had failed to catch or had chosen not to confront the reality of Greek public finances over a period of years. Bond markets drew their conclusions quickly. If Greece had been hiding the true state of its finances, and if the Eurozone's oversight mechanisms had failed to detect or address this, then other assumptions about Eurozone sovereign debt might need to be revisited. The spread between Greek government bonds and German government bonds, the gap in interest rates that investors demanded as compensation for the additional risk of holding Greek rather than German debt, had been narrow through the boom years, compressed almost to nothing by the market's assumption that Eurozone membership conferred a kind of implicit mutual guarantee. Now that spread began to widen, slowly at first, then faster, as investors revised their assessments of what Eurozone membership actually meant and what risks it actually eliminated. To understand what was happening in those bond markets, it helps to sit with the particular logic of sovereign debt and sovereign risk. When a country borrows money by issuing government bonds, investors who buy those bonds are making an assessment of the probability that the government will repay them. A government that controls its own currency can always, in extremis, print money to repay its debts, though doing so creates inflation, which is itself a kind of partial default by eroding the real value of what is repaid. This option, unattractive as it is, provides a backstop that gives investors a degree of comfort. The debt will be repaid in nominal terms, even if inflation means it is worth less in real terms. A government that does not control its own currency, a Eurozone member, which uses a currency managed by the European Central Bank rather than a national institution, does not have this backstop. It cannot print euros. The ECB makes monetary policy for the whole Eurozone, not for the fiscal convenience of any individual member. A Eurozone government that cannot raise enough revenue to service its debts and cannot borrow in the markets at affordable rates faces a genuine constraint. It must either cut spending and raise taxes sharply enough to close the gap, or it must seek external support, or it must default. The currency printing press is not available. This constraint had been understood when the euro was designed. The Maastricht criteria and the Stability and Growth Pact were supposed to prevent Eurozone governments from getting into a position where the constraint became binding, to keep deficits and debts at levels where solvency was never genuinely in question. But those rules had proven easier to agree than to enforce. The political difficulty of telling a fellow Eurozone member that it was spending too much, at a time when no immediate crisis was visible, had repeatedly led to situations where breaches of the rules were noted but not effectively addressed. France and Germany had themselves breached the 3% deficit limit in 2003 and 2004, and had successfully resisted the imposition of the sanctions the rules prescribed. If the largest economies could breach the rules without consequence, the rules' deterrent effect on smaller economies was obviously limited. Now, with Greece's true fiscal position exposed, the constraint that the rules had been designed to prevent became suddenly, urgently real. Greece needed to borrow continuously to roll over its existing debts and finance its ongoing deficit. But the interest rates at which it could borrow in the markets were rising rapidly, as investors demanded more compensation for the risk they were being asked to bear. Higher interest rates meant higher debt service costs, which meant a larger deficit, which meant more borrowing, which meant, in the logic of a debt spiral, even higher rates as investors became more concerned about sustainability. The spiral, once begun, had a momentum of its own. The Eurozone's initial response to Greece's difficulties was hesitant and somewhat confused. The question of whether and how Eurozone members could or should support a fellow member in fiscal difficulty was one that the Maastricht Treaty had deliberately left unclear. There was an __quote, _5, __ clause in the treaty, an article specifying that neither the European Union nor any member state would be liable for the debts of another member state. This clause had been insisted upon by Germany, which wanted to ensure that membership of the Eurozone did not create open-ended fiscal obligations toward less disciplined partners. It was intended to preserve the incentive for each country to manage its own finances responsibly, since the knowledge that others would bail you out if you ran into trouble would reduce that incentive. But the no bailout clause, however clearly intended, had not specified what would actually happen if a Eurozone member found itself unable to service its debts. Default by a Eurozone member was a scenario that the treaty framework had not seriously contemplated, because the convergence criteria and the Stability and Growth Pact were supposed to prevent it from arising. Now that it was arising, the absence of a clear mechanism for addressing it became a serious problem, not just for Greece, but for the entire Eurozone. The fear that drove the eventual response was not primarily about Greece itself. Greece was a small economy. Its gross domestic product was roughly 2.5% of the Eurozone total. A Greek default, viewed in isolation, was manageable in purely economic terms. What was not manageable was the contagion risk, the possibility that a Greek default would cause investors to reassess the debt of other Eurozone members, leading to rising interest rates across southern Europe, potentially triggering crises in countries whose economies were far too large to be rescued in the same way. Ireland and Portugal were the most immediately vulnerable after Greece, both running large deficits, both with banking systems under severe stress, both with economies contracting sharply as the effects of the financial crisis worked through their systems. Spain was larger and initially seemed more resilient, but its banking system was sitting on property loan losses that had not yet been fully acknowledged, and its fiscal position was deteriorating rapidly as unemployment rose and tax revenues collapsed. Italy was larger still, the third largest economy in the Eurozone, with a government debt that was already very high relative to gross domestic product even before the crisis. A debt that needed to be constantly refinanced in the markets, and that would become extremely difficult to manage if Italian borrowing rates rose significantly. The logic of contagion was not irrational. It reflected a genuine uncertainty about the rules of the game inside the Eurozone. If Greece could default, if a Eurozone member's sovereign debt could genuinely lose value, then investors holding the debt of other Eurozone members with less than perfect fiscal positions needed to reconsider whether they were being adequately compensated for the risk. And as they reconsidered, as the spreads on Irish and Portuguese and Spanish and Italian bonds began to widen, the fiscal situations of those countries deteriorated because higher borrowing costs fed directly through to larger deficits and accelerating debt dynamics. What was being revealed through this mechanism was the fundamental architectural tension at the heart of the Eurozone that economists had identified before the euro was even launched. A monetary union without a fiscal union, without shared debt, without a central treasury that could transfer resources from stronger to weaker members, was a structure that worked well in good times and under enormous stress in bad ones. The shock-absorbing mechanisms that existed within nation-states, the automatic flow of taxes and transfers between regions, did not exist at the Eurozone level. When a region of the United States was hit by an economic shock, federal tax revenues fell in that region and federal transfers increased, providing an automatic stabilizing effect that no equivalent mechanism provided within the Eurozone. When Greece or Ireland was hit by a shock, the adjustment had to come entirely from within, from spending cuts, from tax rises, from wage reductions, without any cushioning from the European level. The economists who had raised these concerns before the euro's launch, those who had argued that Europe did not fully satisfy the conditions for an optimal currency area, that the lack of fiscal federalism was a serious structural weakness, were not entirely right in their predictions. They had expected problems to emerge from asymmetric economic shocks, situations where one part of the Eurozone was hit hard while another was doing well, and the crisis did indeed have this character. But the specific mechanism through which the structural weakness expressed itself was somewhat different from what the pre-launch critics had anticipated, involving the particular dynamics of sovereign debt markets and banking systems in ways that had not been fully modelled. Robert Mundell, whose original 1961 paper on optimal currency areas had provided the theoretical framework for this debate, had himself become an enthusiastic supporter of European monetary union, arguing that the discipline it imposed on member states outweighed the lost flexibility of national monetary policy. The crisis of 2010 suggested that the costs of lost flexibility were higher than Mundell's later, more optimistic reading had acknowledged, while the disciplinary benefits of the common currency had proven less effective than hoped. Germany's response to the crisis was deeply shaped by its own economic history and its particular concerns about moral hazard. The German fear, grounded in the hyperinflation of the 1920s and the political catastrophe that followed, and more recently in the experience of German reunification's unexpected costs, was that providing open-ended support to struggling Eurozone members would remove the incentive for those members to make the difficult adjustments their situations required. If Greece knew that Germany would ultimately pay its bills, why would Greece undertake the painful spending cuts and structural reforms that the situation demanded? This concern was not unreasonable in principle, but applied to a crisis of the severity that was unfolding, it translated into a reluctance to provide support that was fast enough and large enough to actually arrest the contagion dynamics that were spreading the crisis. The first Greek support programme, agreed in May of 2010, involved loans from Eurozone members and the International Monetary Fund totalling €110 billion, an enormous sum, but one conditional on Greece implementing an austerity programme of exceptional severity. The conditions attached required Greece to cut public spending, reduce public sector wages and pensions, raise taxes, and undertake structural reforms across its economy, all simultaneously, at a pace and on a scale that had few precedents in peacetime economic history. The economic logic of imposing such severe austerity on an economy already in recession was contested. The standard economic analysis of fiscal multipliers, the relationship between government spending changes and overall economic output, suggested that cutting spending during a recession would reduce output, which would reduce tax revenues, which would worsen the deficit, potentially requiring further cuts in a self-defeating spiral. The IMF's own research, published in the years that followed, would acknowledge that the fiscal multipliers in the Greek programme had been underestimated, that the economic damage from the austerity was greater than the programme's designers had anticipated. But in May of 2010, the priority was to demonstrate to markets that Greece was committed to adjustment, to arrest the contagion by showing that the Eurozone was capable of imposing discipline on a troubled member. The human consequences in Greece were severe and are worth sitting with, even at this calm and unhurried pace, because they were the reality behind the economic abstractions. Greek unemployment, which had been around 10% before the crisis, rose to 27% at its peak. Youth unemployment reached nearly 60%, a figure so extraordinary that it is worth hearing again slowly. Nearly 6 in every 10 young Greeks who wanted to work could not find work. Public sector wages were cut repeatedly. Pensions, which many elderly Greeks depended on entirely, were reduced multiple times. Hospitals ran short of medicines. Schools operated without adequate supplies. Families that had been comfortably middle class found themselves unable to pay utility bills or service mortgages that had seemed entirely manageable before the crisis. The Greek people bore these adjustments with a mixture of stoic endurance and periodic eruptions of anger that expressed itself in street protests, in political radicalization, in a search for explanations and accountability that the existing political parties seemed unable to provide. The crisis destroyed the credibility of the two mainstream parties, the centre-right New Democracy and the centre-left PASOK, that had alternated in government for decades and created the conditions for the rise of new political forces, including the left-wing Syriza Party and, on the other end of the spectrum, the far-right Golden Dawn. Political extremism, as it had in earlier periods of European economic crisis, found fertile ground in the ruins of middle-class security. Ireland's path into the rescue mechanism followed a different route, but arrived at a similarly difficult place. The blanket guarantee of Irish bank liabilities that the Irish government had issued in September of 2008 was proving, through 2010, to carry costs that dwarfed initial estimates. The Irish banking system's property loan losses were enormous, reflecting a construction bubble that, relative to the size of the Irish economy, had been extraordinary even by international standards. As those losses were recognised and the banks required recapitalisation, the Irish state's own fiscal position deteriorated rapidly. Ireland, which had entered the crisis with relatively low government debt, well below the Maastricht 60% threshold, found itself on a trajectory toward very high debt very quickly, as the banking system's losses were transferred to the public balance sheet. By November of 2010, Ireland had accepted a support programme from the European Union and the IMF totalling €85 billion, subject to its own programme of austerity and adjustment. The Irish programme was in some ways easier to implement than the Greek one. Ireland had a more flexible economy, a stronger tradition of institutional compliance, a more straightforward path back to export competitiveness through the wage reductions and productivity improvements that the crisis forced. But it was not without genuine human cost. Irish public sector pay was cut. Social welfare payments were reduced, taxes were raised, emigration, which the Celtic Tiger years had finally reversed, resumed, the familiar bitter Irish experience of sending its young people abroad because there was not enough for them at home. Portugal followed in May of 2011, accepting a programme of €78 billion as its own market access deteriorated, and its fiscal position proved unsustainable without external support. The Portuguese programme required its own set of austerity measures, spending cuts, tax rises, structural reforms, applied to an economy that had been growing slowly even before the crisis and that found the adjustment correspondingly painful. Through all of this, the contagion dynamics that the support programmes were meant to arrest kept spreading. Spanish and Italian bond spreads widened and narrowed as each new development in the crisis, each new programme, each new political statement, each new summit communiqué was assessed by markets trying to determine whether the Eurozone had found a durable solution or merely a temporary respite. Spain's banking system came under increasing pressure as its property loan losses mounted. The Spanish government, initially resistant to the idea that it might need external support, eventually requested assistance specifically for its banking sector in June of 2012. A somewhat different request from the full sovereign programmes of Greece, Ireland and Portugal, but one that further tested the Eurozone's rescue architecture. The rescue mechanisms that were assembled during this period were built necessarily quickly and from materials that were not entirely fit for purpose. The European Financial Stability Facility, created in May of 2010 as a temporary mechanism, was replaced by the permanent European Stability Mechanism in 2012. These institutions could lend to struggling member states, but the funds they commanded, and the speed at which decisions to deploy those funds could be made, given the requirement for unanimous agreement among Eurozone members, were not always commensurate with the speed at which market dynamics could move. The ECB's role in the crisis was complex and, in some respects, the subject of genuine disagreement about what the institution was permitted to do under its mandate. The ECB had been designed as a monetary institution, not a fiscal one. its job was to maintain price stability, not to manage the sovereign debt of member states. Purchasing government bonds on a large scale, effectively financing governments, was seen by some, particularly within the Bundesbank, as crossing a line that the ECB's mandate did not permit. But the ECB began purchasing bonds of stressed Eurozone members through a program called the Securities Markets Program in May of 2010 as a means of maintaining the functioning of monetary policy transmission, the mechanism by which its interest rate decisions actually affected borrowing costs across the Eurozone. If the bond markets of several member states were dysfunctional, if the rates at which those states and their businesses could borrow had become detached from the ECB's policy rate, then monetary policy itself was being undermined. The bond purchases helped at the margin, but did not resolve the fundamental dynamic. Markets continued to test the Eurozone's commitment to its peripheral members. Each summit produced a statement of resolve that calmed markets briefly before the next deterioration. The crisis had a grinding, repetitive quality, each apparent resolution followed by a renewed flare-up that wore down confidence and energy across the Eurozone and beyond. By the summer of 2012, the situation had reached what felt like a genuine inflection point. Spanish and Italian borrowing costs had risen to levels that, if sustained, raised real questions about debt sustainability in both countries. Italy, with its very high stock of outstanding government debt, was particularly sensitive to interest rate movements. Small increases in the rates at which its debt was rolled over translated into very large increases in annual interest payments. The calculations were not reassuring. It was in this context, of rising spreads, of exhausted rescue mechanisms, of markets that seemed to be testing whether the Eurozone itself would hold together, that Mario Draghi, who had become president of the European Central Bank in November of 2011, delivered what would become the most consequential short speech in the history of European monetary policy. On the 26th of July, 2012, speaking at a conference in London, Draghi said that the ECB was ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, and then he added 3 words that the transcript records as a separate sentence, brief and declaratory, within our mandate. The effect on financial markets was immediate and dramatic. Within days, Spanish and Italian bond yields began to fall. The spreads that had been widening through the spring and early summer reversed course. The pressure that had seemed to be building towards some kind of rupture began to ease. What the markets heard in Draghi's words was a commitment that the ECB would not allow the Eurozone to collapse, that if sovereign bond markets became dysfunctional in ways that threatened the currency union itself, the ECB would intervene on a scale sufficient to arrest that dysfunction. The mechanism through which this commitment would be fulfilled was announced in September of 2012 as the Outright Monetary Transactions Programme, a facility under which the ECB could purchase, potentially without limit, the government bonds of Eurozone members that had requested and were complying with a support programme. The purchases would be sterilised. The ECB would remove an equivalent amount of liquidity from the system through other operations to address concerns that they amounted to monetary financing of governments, and they would be conditional on programme compliance, preserving the incentive for adjustment. The crucial aspect of the Outright Monetary Transactions Programme was that it was never actually used. It did not need to be. The credibility of the commitment, the market's belief that the ECB would indeed act if action were required, was sufficient to prevent the conditions from arising that would have required it. This is the paradox at the heart of effective central bank communication. The most powerful tool is often the one you never have to deploy, because the credibility of your willingness to deploy it changes the behaviour of others. Draghi's 3 words, and the programme that followed them, did not resolve the structural problems of the Eurozone. The debts were still there. The divergences in competitiveness between North and South were still there. The incomplete architecture, monetary union without fiscal union, was still there. What had changed was that the existential risk to the currency itself, the risk of a disorderly breakup that would have had consequences well beyond Europe, had been substantially reduced. The breathing room that Draghi's commitment created allowed the gradual, painful work of adjustment and recovery to continue without the additional pressure of markets actively betting on the euro's dissolution. It was not a resolution, it was a stabilization, the kind of imperfect, incomplete, deeply human response to a crisis that does not admit of perfect solutions. Let that be enough for now. Let the tension of those years ease a little, as it did ease slowly and incompletely, and through the second half of 2012 and into 2013, the coins were still in the pockets, the notes were still in the tills, and across the continent, in ways that were painful and uneven and often deeply unfair, the long work of adjustment had begun. It would take years. Some of the costs would never be fully recovered, but the currency held, and in holding, it created the conditions for whatever came next. Rest in that for a moment. Let your breathing slow. The worst of the storm has passed in our story. Even if the rebuilding that follows is slow and difficult work, that rebuilding is where we are going. But not yet. For now, simply rest. Recovery, when it comes after a long period of difficulty, rarely announces itself clearly. It does not arrive on a particular morning with a particular feeling, a sudden lightness that tells you the hard part is over. It comes instead in small and incremental ways, a number that stops getting worse and begins, as tentatively, to improve. A business that decides to hire one more person. A government that finds, for the first time in several years, that its deficit is slightly smaller than the year before rather than slightly larger. A bond market that asks for a little less interest than it demanded the month before. Recovery is quiet and gradual and easily reversible, and for a long time it is difficult to distinguish from a pause in deterioration. The difference only becomes clear in retrospect, when enough of the small improvements have accumulated to constitute something that deserves the name. The Eurozone's recovery from the sovereign debt crisis had exactly this quality. It did not begin on a specific date. It did not feel, to the people living through it, like a decisive turning point. It felt for a long time like a cautious and uncertain improvement that might at any moment reverse. And indeed there were reversals along the way, moments when the numbers moved in the wrong direction again, and the confidence that had been carefully rebuilt was tested once more. But the broad direction, from roughly 2013 onward, was towards stabilisation, and then towards slow growth, and that direction held. Mario Draghi's commitment of July 2012 had created the breathing room that made recovery possible. It had not created the recovery itself. That had to be built piece by piece through decisions made in Frankfurt and Brussels and Berlin, and the capitals of the countries that had been most severely affected, and through the daily decisions of millions of businesses and households adjusting their behaviour in response to changed circumstances. Understanding how that adjustment happened and at what cost requires sitting with the specific mechanisms that were available to Eurozone members trying to restore their economic health without the tool of currency devaluation. The traditional toolkit for a country facing an economic crisis and a loss of competitiveness involves a combination of monetary and fiscal policy. Cut interest rates to stimulate borrowing and spending. Devalue the currency to make exports cheaper and imports more expensive. Run fiscal deficits to support demand while the private sector deleverages. These tools work imperfectly and with delays, but they provide levers through which governments and central banks can influence the pace and character of adjustment. Eurozone members in crisis had none of these tools in their conventional forms. Interest rates were set by the ECB for the whole Eurozone, not for the individual circumstances of Ireland or Greece or Portugal. The exchange rate could not be altered. That was the fundamental commitment of Euro membership. The point of the whole exercise. And fiscal policy was constrained by the support programme's conditions, which required deficit reduction rather than stimulus, and by the market's unwillingness to finance large deficits at affordable rates. What remained was what economists call internal devaluation, the process of making an economy more competitive by reducing costs and prices from within, rather than through exchange rate adjustment. If a country's goods and services are too expensive relative to its competitors, and if the exchange rate cannot be used to correct this, then the prices and wages themselves must fall, or productivity must rise, or some combination of both. This is not impossible. It is in fact what happens in regional economies within large currency areas all the time. When a region of the United States loses competitiveness, wages and prices in that region adjust over time, and labour moves to more competitive regions. But within nations, these adjustments happen within a framework of shared institutions, shared social programs, shared identity, shared legal systems that provide a context and a cushion that makes the adjustment bearable. The Eurozone provided some of this context, but not all of it. and the adjustments required of its most stressed members were of a speed and scale that tested the limits of what democratic societies could absorb. Ireland provides perhaps the clearest example of how internal devaluation worked when conditions were relatively favourable. The Irish economy entered the crisis with a labour market that was somewhat more flexible than those of southern European countries. Wages had risen rapidly during the boom, but could be reduced more readily, partly because a significant portion of the Irish workforce was in sectors like construction and retail, where rapid employment adjustment was possible, and partly because the Irish tradition of social partnership between government, employers, and unions provided a framework for negotiating economy-wide wage adjustments. Irish public sector wages were cut by between 5 and 15% in nominal terms. Private sector wages fell as unemployment rose and the bargaining power of workers decreased. Unit labour costs fell substantially, restoring some of the competitiveness that the boom years had eroded. The Irish export sector, which had never been as exposed to the property bubble as the domestic economy, continued to perform reasonably well throughout the crisis, supported by the presence of multinational companies whose competitive positions were not primarily determined by Irish wage levels. As domestic demand contracted sharply, exports became a larger share of a smaller economy, and the current account deficit that Ireland had been running, borrowing more from the rest of the world than it was earning, swung into surplus. Ireland began earning more than it was spending, allowing it to start paying down the debts it had accumulated. By the end of 2013, Ireland had returned to growth. By the end of 2014, it had exited its support program and regained full access to market financing at rates that, while higher than in the pre-crisis years, were manageable. The Irish recovery was genuine, though it was accompanied by continued high unemployment, significant emigration, and persistent legacy debts in the banking system, and on household balance sheets that would take many more years to work through. It was not a return to the conditions of the boom. Those conditions had been unsustainable and nobody serious was advocating their recreation. It was a return to the capacity for normal economic life, which was a meaningful achievement given how severely that capacity had been compromised. Portugal's adjustment followed a similar path, though more slowly and with less of the multinational sector underpinning that gave Ireland particular advantages. Portuguese exports grew as competitiveness improved. Tourism expanded, the deficit narrowed, growth resumed tentatively in 2014 and then more solidly in the years that followed. Portugal exited its support program in May of 2014, also without seeking a precautionary credit line, a demonstration of recovered market confidence that its government emphasised as a point of national pride. Greece's adjustment was more complex, more painful, and more contested, reflecting both the greater severity of Greece's initial fiscal imbalance and the deeper structural challenges of the Greek economy. The first support program of 2010 had been built on economic projections that proved far too optimistic. The assumption that the economy would contract modestly and then recover had collided with the reality of fiscal multipliers considerably larger than the program's designers had used. By 2011, it was clear that Greece's debt, even after the austerity measures being implemented, was not on a sustainable trajectory. The debt simply could not be repaid in full without economic growth that the austerity program was itself preventing. In February of 2012, after months of negotiation, an agreement was reached for a restructuring of Greek government debt held by private creditors, the largest sovereign debt restructuring in history to that point. Private holders of Greek government bonds accepted losses of roughly 53% on the face value of their holdings, and additional losses when the new bonds they received in exchange were valued at market prices. The total reduction in privately held debt was in the range of 100 billion euros. It was a significant measure that provided some relief, but it came too late and was too limited to resolve Greece's situation definitively by the time it occurred. Much of the privately held debt had already been replaced by official loans from Eurozone partners and the IMF, debt that was not restructured and whose full repayment remained a legal and political commitment. Greece received a second support program in 2012 and then a third in 2015, when a newly elected government led by Syriza, the left-wing party that had risen to prominence on a platform of opposing the austerity conditions, sought to renegotiate the terms of the adjustment. The negotiations that took place in the first half of 2015 between the Greek government and its European creditors were among the most dramatic in the history of the European Union, a confrontation between a government that had been democratically elected on a mandate to end austerity and creditors who insisted that the conditions attached to continued support could not be substantially altered. The confrontation reached its peak in July of 2015, when Greece held a referendum in which a majority of Greek voters rejected the latest creditor proposal, and then, within days, the Greek government accepted a programme broadly similar to what had been rejected, because the alternative, exit from the Eurozone, a prospect that had moved from theoretical to immediately conceivable, was deemed too damaging to risk. This episode illustrated with unusual clarity the constraint that Euro membership imposed on the political choices available to Eurozone governments. The democratic mandate of the Syriza government was real. The suffering that the austerity programs had imposed on the Greek people was real. But the capacity to act on that mandate within the Eurozone was constrained by the terms on which continued membership was available. A country that controlled its own currency could, if its government chose, simply print money to fund public spending, accepting the inflationary consequences but maintaining a degree of autonomy over its economic choices. A Eurozone member could not. Its choices were constrained by the ECB, by the support programs, by the markets that financed its debt. The tension between democratic sovereignty and the disciplines of monetary union was laid bare in a way that the Euro's architects had not anticipated, or had chosen not to fully confront. While Greece struggled with its third programme and the long grinding work of structural reform and fiscal adjustment, the broader Eurozone was moving slowly and unevenly toward recovery. The ECB was the key instrument of this broader recovery. With interest rates already low by historical standards, the ECB moved into the unconventional monetary policy territory that other major central banks, the Federal Reserve in the United States, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, had entered during and after the financial crisis. In June of 2014, the ECB became the first major central bank to move its deposit rate, the rate it paid on reserves that commercial banks held at the ECB, into negative territory. A negative deposit rate meant that banks were charged for holding excess reserves at the central bank rather than earning interest on them. The intention was to push banks to deploy those reserves into the real economy, to lend them to businesses and households rather than holding them passively. It was an unusual measure, and the ECB moved carefully, adjusting the rate gradually through 2015 and 2016 to levels that would have seemed extraordinary a decade earlier. More significant in scale was the launch of the ECB's asset purchase program, its version of the quantitative easing that other central banks had already implemented, in January of 2015. Under this program, the ECB began purchasing government bonds and other assets at a rate of €60 billion per month, later expanded to €80 billion per month, injecting money into the financial system on a scale that dwarfed anything the ECB had previously done. The purchases were distributed across Eurozone member states in proportion to each country's shareholding in the ECB. Germany received the largest share, followed by France and Italy, with the purchases conducted by the national central banks on behalf of the system as a whole. The legal and institutional drama surrounding the asset purchase program was considerable. The German Bundesbank, true to its institutional instincts, was sceptical of the program and concerned that it crossed the line between monetary policy, the ECB's legitimate domain, and fiscal policy, which remained the preserve of member state governments. Several German economic professors and politicians brought legal challenges before the German Constitutional Court, which in turn referred questions to the European Court of Justice. The legal proceedings took years to resolve and created ongoing uncertainty about the programme's durability. But the programme continued, and the European Court of Justice ultimately affirmed its legality, finding that it fell within the ECB's mandate as a monetary policy instrument. The effects of the ECB's unconventional policies were real, if not uniformly distributed or immediately visible. Interest rates across the Eurozone fell to historically low levels. Mortgage rates for households, borrowing rates for businesses, financing costs for governments, all declined as the ECB's massive purchases drove bond yields down across the Eurozone. For countries still carrying heavy debt loads from the crisis years, lower interest rates meant lower debt service costs, providing some fiscal relief. For businesses that had been reluctant to invest while the economic outlook was uncertain, lower borrowing costs reduced one barrier to investment decisions. The recovery that gradually emerged through 2014, 2015, and 2016 was real but modest. Growth rates across the Eurozone that were positive but well below what would have been needed to make rapid progress on the unemployment legacies of the crisis years. Unemployment in the Eurozone as a whole fell from its peak of around 12% in 2013, a figure that concealed very wide variation between near full employment in Germany and Austria and unemployment above 20% in Greece and Spain, but fell slowly, and the human costs of extended unemployment, particularly for young people who had been unable to find work for years, were not quickly reversed. The banking system through which the ECB's monetary policy had to be transmitted to reach the real economy remained a constraint on the recovery. European banks, many of which were still carrying significant volumes of non-performing loans on which borrowers were not meeting their repayment obligations, on their balance sheets, were reluctant to extend new credit aggressively while those legacy problems remained. The relationship between weak banks and weak economic growth was circular and self-reinforcing. Weak banks lent less, which meant weaker economic activity, which meant more loans going bad, which meant weaker banks. Breaking this cycle required addressing the non-performing loan problem directly, which in turn required either banks raising more capital or governments providing support for bank restructuring, both of which were politically and financially difficult. The banking union that the Eurozone began constructing from 2012 onward was designed partly to address these problems and partly to prevent their recurrence. The single supervisory mechanism, which gave the ECB direct responsibility for supervising the largest Eurozone banks, came into operation in November of 2014 after a comprehensive assessment of bank balance sheets, the asset quality review, that was intended to establish a credible baseline of what the banking system actually looked like. The assessment identified capital shortfalls at a number of institutions and required them to be addressed. Its completion and the assumption of supervisory responsibility by the ECB represented a genuine step toward the financial integration that the pre-crisis years had lacked. The single resolution mechanism, which provided a framework for winding down failing banks in an orderly way without automatic resort to taxpayer bailouts, followed in 2015. The framework established a bail-in principle, requiring shareholders and certain creditors to bear losses before public funds were used, that reflected the lesson, learned painfully from the Irish Guarantee and other crisis-era interventions, that blanket government guarantees of bank liabilities created enormous contingent fiscal risks. Whether the bail-in framework would work smoothly under the stress of a future crisis was a question that could only be answered by experience, but its establishment represented a meaningful improvement in the architecture. What remained incomplete, and what remained the subject of ongoing political debate, and was the third leg of banking union. A common deposit insurance scheme that would guarantee bank deposits across the Eurozone from a shared European fund rather than from individual national funds. The absence of common deposit insurance meant that a depositor in a Greek bank and a depositor in a German bank had deposits guaranteed by very different institutions. The Greek Deposit Guarantee Fund was backed by the Greek government's creditworthiness, while the German fund was backed by Germany's. This asymmetry meant that in a severe crisis, the value of deposit insurance depended on where your bank happened to be headquartered, which undermined the principle of a single banking market. Germany, and other northern creditor countries, consistently resisted the completion of banking union through a common deposit insurance scheme, arguing that legacy problems in southern European banking systems needed to be resolved before risk-sharing through common insurance was appropriate. Southern European countries argued that risk-sharing and risk reduction needed to proceed together, that a genuinely integrated banking market was not achievable without common deposit insurance. This debate remained unresolved through the recovery years and beyond, a standing reminder of the limits of what had been built. The structural reforms that the crisis programs had required, and that Eurozone policy frameworks had encouraged more broadly, produced mixed results. Some reforms were implemented and produced genuine improvements in economic flexibility and efficiency. Labour market reforms in Spain, for instance, made hiring and firing somewhat easier and contributed to a recovery in Spanish employment that was faster than many had expected. Reforms to pension systems, to professional licensing, to product market regulation, These accumulated gradually and improved the functioning of economies in ways that were difficult to attribute to any single measure but real nonetheless. Other reforms were implemented partially or reversed under political pressure once the immediate crisis had passed. The political economy of structural reform has a consistent pattern. The costs of reform are concentrated and immediate, felt by specific groups who can organize to oppose the reform, while the benefits are diffuse and long delayed, accruing to broader populations in ways that are difficult to connect to the specific policy. This pattern makes sustained structural reform difficult in democratic systems, and the Eurozone's experience through the recovery years confirmed it. Progress was made, but less than the programs had envisaged, and some gains were partially given back when governments changed and political pressures shifted. The broader debate about what the Eurozone needed to become, the debate between those who thought it needed more integration and those who thought it needed more flexibility, continued through the recovery years without resolution. The Five Presidents' Report of 2015, authored by the presidents of the five main European institutions, laid out a vision for completing the economic and monetary union through measures including a fiscal capacity for the Eurozone as a whole, a European treasury, and a genuine capital markets union. It was a thoughtful document and a serious attempt to map the path from where the Eurozone was to where its architects believed it needed to be. But the political will to implement its recommendations in full did not exist. Germany was willing to contemplate deeper integration in some areas, but remained resistant to measures that would create open-ended fiscal transfers to other member states. The fear of a permanent subsidy relationship, of the Eurozone becoming a mechanism by which German taxpayers funded the spending of southern European governments, was politically powerful and not easily dismissed. France was more willing to accept risk-sharing measures, but less willing to accept the German insistence on stricter enforcement of fiscal rules as the price for that sharing. The negotiation between these two positions, between discipline and solidarity, between rules and flexibility, continued without definitive resolution. What emerged from the recovery years was not the completed architecture that the Five Presidents' Report had envisioned, but a somewhat strengthened and somewhat more resilient version of the incomplete architecture that had struggled through the crisis. The banking union was partial but real. The ESM provided a rescue mechanism that had not existed before the crisis. The ECB's expanded toolkit, its unconventional policies, its demonstrated willingness to act forcefully when the euro's integrity was threatened, provided a backstop that changed the dynamics of future crises. The Eurozone was more robust than it had been in 2012. It was not as robust as a complete fiscal and political union would have been. This is perhaps an honest description of where human institutions tend to arrive after extended periods of crisis and reform. Not at the ideal destination, but at a place that is meaningfully better than where they started, still incomplete, still carrying the unresolved tensions of their origins, but functional in the ways that matter most for the daily lives of the people who depend on them. The recovery was real. The reforms were real. The remaining vulnerabilities were real. All three things were true simultaneously, as they often are when we look honestly at the complex, imperfect structures through which human societies organize their economic lives. Let that complexity rest with you gently, without demanding resolution. The Eurozone in the middle years of the second decade of the new century was a work in progress, as it had always been, as it remains. That is not a failure. It is a description of how large and ambitious human projects actually exist in time, always becoming, never quite finished, always carrying the weight of their history and the uncertainty of their future. Breathe slowly. The story is moving toward its final chapters now, toward the present and the questions that the present still holds open. There is no urgency. Let the recovery settle into your awareness the way that recovery settles into the lived experience of those who have been through difficulty. Gradually, incompletely, with a gratitude that is real, even though it is mixed with the memory of what was lost. There is a quality that long-running experiments acquire after they have survived their most serious tests. It is not quite confidence. Confidence was what existed before the tests, and what the tests revealed to be somewhat premature. It is something more seasoned than confidence, something that carries within it the memory of difficulty, and the knowledge that difficulty was survived. Call it tempered resilience, perhaps. The knowledge, earned rather than assumed, that the structure holds, not perfectly, not without cost, not without ongoing vulnerability, but holds nonetheless, through conditions that were genuinely severe enough to have destroyed it. The Eurozone that emerged from the sovereign debt crisis and its slow recovery carried exactly this quality. It was not the Eurozone that its most enthusiastic architects had imagined in the 1990s, unified, convergent, its internal differences smoothed by the disciplines of shared monetary policy and the opportunities of an integrated market. But it was something real and something durable, tested in ways that its designers had not fully anticipated and found, if not perfect, then genuinely robust in the ways that mattered most for the hundreds of millions of people whose daily lives it structured. Understanding where the Eurozone arrived after the crisis years requires sitting with a paradox that runs through the entire history we have been tracing. The Euro's survival through the sovereign debt crisis was not primarily the result of the architecture being stronger than its critics feared. In important ways, the architecture was exactly as weak as its critics had warned. The lack of fiscal union, the absence of shared debt, the inadequacy of the adjustment mechanisms available to member states in crisis, all of these proved to be genuine problems with genuine costs. The euro survived not because these problems did not exist, but because the political will to hold the union together at each moment of maximum pressure proved stronger than the economic logic that pointed toward dissolution. The commitment to the project, imperfectly constructed as it was, turned out to be more durable than the markets betting against it had assumed. This is an important thing to understand about the euro, and about large political and economic projects more generally. They do not survive primarily because of their technical design. They survive because enough people, in enough places, with enough power to make consequential decisions, continue to believe that the project is worth preserving. When Draghi said that the ECB would do whatever it takes, he was not announcing a technical monetary policy decision. He was making a political statement about the commitment of European institutions to the euro's survival, a statement that derived its power not from the ECB's balance sheet, but from the political backing that statement was understood to have, from Berlin to Paris to Rome to Madrid. The years from roughly 2014 through 2019, the years between the acute phase of the sovereign debt crisis and the arrival of the next great shock, were years in which the Eurozone lived with this tempered resilience, working through the legacy problems of the crisis while navigating ongoing political and economic challenges that tested the project in different ways. Growth returned across the Eurozone through this period, though at rates that varied considerably between member states and that remained modest by pre-crisis standards. Germany, having undertaken its labour market reforms in the early 2000s, and having maintained its export competitiveness through the crisis years, grew steadily. Its unemployment rate fell to levels not seen since reunification, below 5% by the middle of the decade, a remarkable achievement for an economy of 80 million people that had struggled with 9 and 10% unemployment in the early 2000s. German exporters, selling machinery and automobiles and chemicals to customers around the world, generated surpluses that accumulated to levels that attracted criticism from trading partners, the United States and the IMF. And the European Commission itself periodically observed that Germany's persistent current account surplus, running at 6, 7, 8% of gross domestic product through these years, was a macroeconomic imbalance that had implications beyond Germany's borders. The criticism had merit, in the sense that Germany's surplus was the mirror image of deficits elsewhere. If Germany was selling more than it was buying from the rest of the world, someone else was necessarily buying more than they were selling to Germany. Within the Eurozone, the discipline of the shared currency meant that the countries running deficits could not devalue their way back to balance. The adjustment had to come through other means, and the asymmetry of adjustment, surplus countries under less immediate pressure to change than deficit countries, was a persistent structural feature of the Eurozone's internal dynamics. Spain's recovery was, in economic terms, one of the more successful stories of the post-crisis years. The labour market reforms implemented during the crisis years, combined with the improvement in external competitiveness that internal devaluation had achieved, produced growth rates through the middle years of the decade that were among the strongest in the Eurozone. Spanish unemployment, which had reached those extraordinary levels above 25% at the crisis peak, fell steadily, a long way from full employment and carrying a legacy of long-term unemployment and young people whose careers had been permanently disrupted, but falling in ways that were genuinely meaningful for those who found work. Ireland's recovery was robust, though complicated by the particular features of the Irish economy, including the presence of very large multinational companies whose tax arrangements and accounting practices produced national income statistics that were, in the technical language of Irish economic commentary, occasionally misleading about the actual living standards of Irish people. When one major pharmaceutical company relocated intellectual property to Ireland in 2015, it produced a reported growth rate for the Irish economy that year of around 26%, a figure that provoked the Irish economist who coined the term, quote, six, to describe the phenomenon of statistical artifacts that bore little relationship to the lived experience of the Irish population. The underlying economy was doing well, but not 26% well. Portugal's recovery was slower, but real. The Portuguese economy grew through the mid-decade years, tourism expanded significantly, unemployment fell, and the country that had required an international rescue in 2011 regained full market access at affordable rates. There was a quiet pride in Portugal's recovery, a sense that the adjustment had been made, the costs had been paid, and something more sustainable had been built on the other side. Greece remained the most difficult case. The third support programme agreed in 2015 ran until 2018, when Greece finally exited the formal programme and returned to market financing. But the legacy of a decade of economic contraction was severe. Greek gross domestic product at the programme's end was roughly 25% below its pre-crisis peak, a contraction comparable in scale to what the United States had experienced during the Great Depression. Greek unemployment remained very high. The country's demographic profile had been affected by sustained emigration of young, educated Greeks who had left to find opportunities that their home country could not offer during the crisis years. Many of them did not return. The human capital lost to emigration, the doctors, engineers, teachers, entrepreneurs who built their careers elsewhere, was a cost that did not show up in fiscal balance sheets, but was nonetheless real and significant. The political consequences of a decade of economic difficulty in Greece were profound and lasting. The mainstream parties that had governed Greece alternately for decades, New Democracy and PASOK, had both been deeply discredited by the crisis, whether as authors of the fiscal problems that preceded it, or as implementers of the austerity that followed. Syriza, which had come to power in January of 2015, governed through the third programme and its aftermath, implementing measures that were in many respects similar to what its predecessors would have implemented, caught between the mandate its voters had given it and the constraints that Eurozone membership imposed. The political landscape that the crisis left behind in Greece was one of fragmentation, volatility, and a deep skepticism about both domestic institutions and European ones. Through these recovery years, the ECB continued to operate in unconventional policy territory. The asset purchase programme, having been launched in January of 2015, was extended and expanded multiple times as the ECB assessed that the inflation rate, persistently below its target of close to but below 2%, warranted continued stimulus. The inflation that the programme's critics had feared, particularly within the Bundesbank tradition, where the memory of hyperinflation created a near-instinctive aversion to any policy that might be seen as excessive money creation, stubbornly failed to materialise. The Eurozone through the mid and late decade remained in an environment of very low inflation, sometimes touching the edges of deflation, driven by a combination of weak demand, technological change, globalisation, and the aftermath of the debt overhang from the crisis years. Low inflation, persistently, was a challenge for the Eurozone in a specific technical way. When inflation is very low, real interest rates, the rate adjusted for inflation, can remain high, even when nominal rates are very low, or even negative. And when real interest rates are high relative to growth rates, debt sustainability becomes more difficult. The economy grows less quickly than the cost of servicing debt, making the debt burden larger over time rather than smaller. The ECB's unconventional policies were partly an attempt to push back against this dynamic, to keep real interest rates low enough that the debt accumulated during the crisis years would gradually become more manageable as economies grew. The ECB began the process of normalising its policy in late 2018, tapering its asset purchases and eventually ending the net purchase phase, while maintaining its stock of holdings by reinvesting the proceeds of maturing bonds. This normalisation was tentative and carefully communicated. The ECB was acutely aware that withdrawing support too quickly could produce the kind of growth setback that had followed the premature fiscal consolidation of 2010 and 2011. The lesson of moving carefully, of not declaring victory prematurely, had been absorbed. It was in this environment of tentative recovery and ongoing policy normalisation that the next great shock arrived, one that was wholly unlike the sovereign debt crisis in its origins, but that would test the Eurozone's solidarity and institutional capacity in ways that were, in some respects, more demanding than anything the crisis years had produced. In late 2019 and early 2020, a new respiratory illness emerged from China and began spreading rapidly around the world. By March of 2020, the World Health Organization had declared a pandemic. Governments across Europe, confronting a disease that was spreading faster than their health systems could manage, and for which no vaccine or effective treatment yet existed, began implementing lockdowns, closing businesses, restricting movement, requiring people to stay at home. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. Economic activity in the second quarter of 2020 fell at rates that had no peacetime precedent. The Eurozone economy contracted by around 12% in that single quarter, a speed and depth of contraction that exceeded anything the sovereign debt crisis had produced. The initial instinct of several European governments as the pandemic hit was to fall back on national responses, to manage their own health systems, their own economic support programs, their own fiscal responses. The memory of the sovereign debt crisis and the rancour it had generated between creditor and debtor countries made the prospect of a coordinated European response seem, to some, politically difficult. Old arguments about moral hazard, about the responsibility of national governments for their own situations, surfaced again in the early weeks of the pandemic. But the pandemic had a quality that was different from the sovereign debt crisis in a crucial respect. It was not a crisis that any country had brought on itself through its own fiscal choices. It was an external shock, genuinely symmetrical in origin, hitting every country simultaneously through a mechanism that was entirely beyond any government's control. Italy and Spain, which were among the first European countries to be severely affected, were suffering not because of past profligacy, but because of geography and timing. The political and moral argument for solidarity was correspondingly stronger than it had been during the sovereign debt crisis, when the narratives of responsibility and irresponsibility had been more easily deployed. The European response to the pandemic, after the initial fragmented national reactions, evolved into something more collectively ambitious than anything attempted during the sovereign debt crisis. The ECB moved quickly, announcing in March of 2020 a new pandemic emergency purchase programme, with an initial envelope of €750 billion. Later, the pandemic emergency purchase programme operated with fewer constraints than previous programmes. It could deviate from the capital key that governed normal purchases, buying more of some countries' bonds and less of others depending on market conditions, providing the flexibility that the crisis demanded. Crucially and unprecedentedly, the fiscal response to the pandemic was partly coordinated at the European level in a way that nothing in the sovereign debt crisis had managed. In July of 2020, after months of difficult negotiation, European Union leaders agreed on a recovery fund, the Next Generation EU programme, with a total value of €750 billion, of which €390 billion would be distributed as grants, rather than loans to member states. The grants did not need to be repaid. They were financed by the European Union borrowing collectively in the capital markets, issuing bonds backed by the collective creditworthiness of the Union as a whole, rather than by any individual member state. This was, in the context of European history, a genuinely remarkable step. It was the first time that the European Union had borrowed on this scale on behalf of its members, distributing the proceeds partly as outright grants. It was, in a limited and temporary and carefully conditioned form, the kind of fiscal capacity at the European level that economists had argued the Eurozone needed since before the single currency was launched. The northern creditor countries, the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, Sweden, which formed the self-described "7" and had resisted the proposal most firmly, ultimately agreed after securing conditions on the use of the funds and assurances about the temporary nature of the borrowing. Whether the Next Generation EU programme represented a permanent shift in European fiscal arrangements, or a one-off response to extraordinary circumstances was, in the years immediately following its announcement, genuinely unclear. The optimistic interpretation, pressed by France and the southern European countries that had advocated most strongly for the programme, was that the precedent had been set, that the taboo against collective European borrowing had been broken, and that future crises would be met with similar instruments. The sceptical interpretation, maintained by the frugal countries and the German Bundesbank, was that the programme was explicitly temporary and conditional, that no permanent fiscal capacity had been agreed, and that the conditions under which collective borrowing had been accepted were specific to the pandemic and would not automatically apply in future circumstances. Both interpretations were supportable from the text of the agreements reached. Which one would prove correct depended on political choices that had not yet been made, on whether European leaders, in future moments of difficulty or opportunity, would build on the pandemic precedent or treat it as an exception. The argument between those who saw the euro as a project that needed to deepen toward fiscal union and those who saw it as a monetary arrangement that should remain strictly limited to monetary matters continued, as it had always continued, without definitive resolution. The pandemic's economic consequences, severe as they were in 2020, were followed by a recovery that was faster than many had feared, supported by the ECB's monetary stimulus, by the next-generation EU disbursements, and by the extraordinary effectiveness of the vaccine programs that were rolled out through 2021. The Eurozone economy recovered its pre-pandemic level of output more quickly than the models used during the crisis had suggested would be possible, partly because the pandemic shock, for all its severity, had not destroyed productive capacity in the way that a financial crisis and debt deflation does. The recovery from the pandemic brought its own complications, however. The combination of supply chain disruptions, factories that had been closed or reduced in capacity, shipping networks that had been disrupted, commodity markets thrown into imbalance by the sudden stop and then sudden restart of global economic activity, and enormous fiscal and monetary stimulus produced, in 2021 and into 2022, the return of inflation that had been absent for a decade. Energy prices rose sharply, amplified in Europe by the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, which disrupted the natural gas supplies that several European economies, Germany most significantly, had come to depend upon heavily. Inflation in the Eurozone rose to levels not seen since the currency's early years, reaching above 10% in late 2022 before beginning to fall as energy prices stabilized and the ECB's policy response took effect. The ECB's response to the inflation surge was a rapid reversal of the unconventional policies that had defined the previous decade, a series of interest rate increases that raised the deposit rate from -50 basis points to 4% in the space of about 14 months, the fastest tightening cycle in the ECB's history. Managing this tightening cycle, raising rates quickly enough to bring inflation under control while not triggering a return of the financial stress that higher rates could impose on heavily indebted Eurozone members, required the ECB to develop yet another instrument, the Transmission Protection Instrument, announced in July of 2022, which stood ready to purchase bonds of specific member states if their spreads widened in ways that the ECB judged to be unwarranted by economic fundamentals, threatening the even transmission of monetary policy across the Eurozone. The instrument was, in its essentials, a more explicit and flexible version of the outright monetary transactions program that Draghi had announced in 2012, another whatever-it-takes commitment, updated and refined by a decade of experience. The management of this inflation episode, raising rates rapidly without triggering a new sovereign debt crisis, bringing inflation down without causing a severe recession, was, by the mid-years of the decade, being cautiously described as broadly successful. Inflation was falling. The Eurozone economy had avoided the severe recession that some had feared as the price of the tightening cycle. The sovereign spreads of peripheral Eurozone members had widened modestly during the tightening, but had not reached the levels that had threatened the currency union a decade earlier. The tempered resilience that the post-crisis Eurozone had developed was holding. The countries that had remained outside the euro continued to have their own stories. Britain, which had voted to leave the European Union entirely in June of 2016, a decision driven by many factors, of which Euroscepticism was one among several, completed its departure from the European Union in January of 2020. The consequences of that departure for the relationship between Britain and the Eurozone economies remained a matter of ongoing adjustment and negotiation. The question of whether Britain had made the right economic choice was, and would remain for years, genuinely difficult to answer, complicated by the confounding effects of the pandemic, by global economic shifts, by the difficulty of constructing a reliable counterfactual. Denmark, which had long maintained its krone in a tight peg against the euro through its ERM2 participation, continued its distinctive position, its currency moving in lockstep with the euro through market operations and interest rate alignment, enjoying most of the exchange rate stability of euro membership without the formal institutional commitment. Sweden continued outside the exchange rate mechanism, its krona floating freely, its central bank making independent monetary policy decisions. Both countries retained options that formal euro membership would have foreclosed, and both found those options useful at various points through the turbulent decade between 2015 and 2025. The countries that had joined the euro after the original 12 continued to join, slowly and in ones and twos, as they met the criteria and their governments chose to proceed. Lithuania became the 19th member of the Eurozone in January of 2015, completing the Baltic trio. Croatia joined in January of 2023, becoming the 20th member, the first country to join since the sovereign debt crisis, a demonstration that the currency, for all its difficulties, retained its attraction as a destination for smaller European economies seeking the stability and credibility that membership conferred. The Eurozone of 20 countries covered a territory and a population, and an economic output that made it, indisputably, one of the major poles of the global economy. Even if its governance remained incomplete, its internal tensions unresolved, its architecture still in the process of being built. What the recovery years and the pandemic years and the inflation years revealed cumulatively was something that the euro story had been demonstrating since the beginning, that the currency was not a finished project but an ongoing one. It was not a mechanism that, once established, operated independently of political will and human judgment. It required, at each moment of difficulty, new choices about how far solidarity would extend, new decisions about what instruments the institutions would use, new negotiations between governments with different interests and different histories and different electorates to answer to. This is not a weakness unique to the euro. All large human institutions have this character. They are maintained by ongoing choices, sustained by continuing commitments. Their survival never permanently guaranteed, but always contingent on the willingness of those within them to keep choosing them. What is perhaps distinctive about the euro is that this contingency is more visible than it is for most institutions, because the euro is young enough that the people who built it are still alive. The decisions that created it are still within living memory, and the alternatives to it, the old currencies, the old arrangements, are not so remote as to be unimaginable. The question of what the euro is finally is not only an economic question, it is a question about what Europe is, about whether the nations that share the currency share enough else to sustain the solidarity that the currency requires. The history we have traced suggests that the answer is yes, but barely, and with costs and with ongoing work, and without certainty about the future. That is perhaps the most honest answer available. Let it rest there, in that honest uncertainty. Without anxiety. The experiment continues, the coins are still in the pockets, the notes are still in the tills, and across a continent that chose, against long odds and with imperfect tools, to share something as intimate as money, life goes on. Ordinary, resilient, always becoming, never quite finished. Breathe slowly. We're almost at the end of our journey now. There is just a little further to go, and then the questions can rest, and you can rest with them until morning. We have travelled a long way together tonight. From the exchange booths at European border crossings in the 1960s, where travellers watched small portions of their money disappear in the transaction, through the political bargains of the Maastricht years, through the extraordinary logistical achievement of introducing physical notes and coins to hundreds of millions of people in a single night, through the boom years and the crisis years and the slow, costly, incomplete recovery. We have followed the euro from dream to institution to crisis, from crisis to something that deserves, with appropriate humility, to be called survival. It is worth pausing here near the end to simply register what the euro is in the present, not as a project or a process or a debate, but as a fact of daily life for a very large number of people on a specific patch of the Earth's surface. More than 340 million people use the euro as their everyday currency. They reach for it in the morning when they buy coffee. They receive it at the end of the working week. They save it and spend it and worry about having enough of it, and occasionally find more of it than they expected. For the youngest among them, those born in the early 2000s and after, the euro is not an experiment or a political statement, or the outcome of a historical process they lived through. It is simply money, the only money they have ever known. The currency in which they learned to count, in which they first understood what things cost, in which their earliest economic experiences were denominated. This generational naturalness is one of the most significant things about the euro at this point in its existence. Currencies acquire legitimacy over time not primarily through arguments or institutions, but through the accumulated weight of ordinary use. Every transaction conducted in euros, every loaf of bread bought, every rent payment made, every salary deposited, adds another small layer of normalcy to the currency's existence. After more than 2 decades of physical circulation, the euro has accumulated an enormous weight of this ordinary legitimacy. It is woven into the fabric of daily life across a continent in ways that would be genuinely difficult and genuinely costly to undo, even if there were political will to do so, which in any broad sense there is not. The euro's position in the global financial system reflects this accumulated legitimacy. It is the second most held reserve currency in the world, after the United States dollar. Central banks and sovereign wealth funds from countries far beyond Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East, hold a portion of their foreign exchange reserves in euros, as a store of value and as a hedge against the dollar's dominance. Approximately 20% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in euros, a figure that has been relatively stable over the past decade, suggesting that the currency has found a settled role in the international monetary system rather than either expanding toward dollar parity or declining toward marginal relevance. The euro's role as a reserve currency is not simply a financial phenomenon. It reflects that this judgment continues to be made after the sovereign debt crisis, after the pandemic, after the inflation episode, is itself a form of testimony to the euro's resilience. The 20 countries that now constitute the eurozone represent a range of economic sizes and characters that would have seemed implausibly diverse to the designers of optimal currency area theory in the 1960s. Germany's economy, the largest, the most export-oriented, the most influential in setting the ECB's institutional culture, coexists with Malta's, which is tiny enough that its entire economic output would barely register as a rounding error in German national accounts. Finland and Portugal, Greece and Luxembourg, Estonia and Italy. These economies have different structures, different labour market institutions, different demographic profiles, different industrial bases, different relationships to the global economy. Holding them together within a single monetary framework requires ongoing negotiation and accommodation of exactly the kind that the euro's history has been full of. The 10 European Union member states that are not yet in the eurozone occupy a variety of positions relative to potential membership. Some are committed to joining and are working to meet the criteria. Bulgaria and Romania have been in this position for years. Their paths complicated by requirements around exchange rate stability and financial sector development that have taken longer to satisfy than initially anticipated. Others maintain formal obligations to join eventually, but are in practice in no hurry. Sweden's status as a country, legally obliged to join the euro when it meets the criteria, but choosing not to meet the exchange rate mechanism criterion, that is a prerequisite, has continued essentially unchanged for 2 decades. Denmark's opt-out, the formal exception negotiated in the aftermath of its 1992 referendum rejection, gives it a legal basis for staying out that Sweden's more creative arrangement does not quite provide. The diversity within the eurozone and at its edges is a reminder that European monetary integration has always been a project with variable geometry, different countries at different stages, with different formal commitments and different practical relationships to the shared currency. This variable geometry is sometimes presented as a weakness, a sign that the project has not fully succeeded in creating the unified monetary space its founders envisioned. It can also be read differently, as a demonstration of the project's flexibility, its capacity to accommodate different national situations and different national preferences, while maintaining a core that is sufficiently coherent to function. The unresolved tensions that the sovereign debt crisis exposed remain present, if less immediately threatening. The North-South divide in economic performance and in attitudes toward fiscal solidarity has not been bridged by the recovery years or the pandemic response. Germany and the Netherlands continue to resist the creation of permanent fiscal transfer mechanisms at the Eurozone level, the kind of automatic stabilizers that would allow resources to flow from stronger to weaker regions when shocks hit, as they do within nation-states. Southern European countries continue to argue that a monetary union without such mechanisms is fundamentally incomplete, that the adjustment burden falls too heavily on the countries most in difficulty. That solidarity in monetary policy needs to be matched by solidarity in fiscal policy. This argument will not be resolved soon, and perhaps will not be resolved fully in any of our lifetimes. It touches questions about identity and sovereignty, and the meaning of nationhood that do not yield to economic reasoning alone. What is encouraging, if one is disposed to find encouragement in the story, is that the argument continues, that the Eurozone continues to function and to evolve while this fundamental disagreement about its ultimate character remains unresolved. Institutions that can sustain productive disagreement about their own nature, without that disagreement tearing them apart, are more resilient than institutions that require consensus on first principles before they can operate. The next generation EU programme, and the question of what precedent it set, remains one of the most important open questions in European economic governance. The programme is dispersing its funds through the middle years of the decade, with grants flowing to member states in support of investment programmes focused on green transition and digital transformation. The two large structural shifts that European policymakers have identified as defining economic challenges of the coming decades. Whether the programme will be followed by permanent mechanisms of a similar kind, whether the act of collective borrowing will become a regular tool of European economic policy rather than an emergency exception, is a question that the political negotiations of the coming years will determine. The green transition itself is a dimension of the euro's future that deserves attention. The European Union has committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2050, net zero greenhouse gas emissions, a transformation of the energy system and the industrial base that is without precedent in peacetime economic history. The investment required is enormous. The ECB has begun incorporating climate considerations into its monetary policy operations, tilting its asset purchases toward bonds issued by companies with better climate profiles, incorporating climate risks into its financial stability assessments. This greening of central banking is contentious. Critics argue it takes the ECB beyond its mandate, pulling it into political territory that should be reserved for elected governments. But it reflects the ECB's assessment that climate change poses risks to price stability and financial stability that it cannot responsibly ignore. The euro's relationship to the broader transformation of global finance is also evolving in ways that were difficult to anticipate when the currency was designed in the 1990s. The rise of digital payments, and then of digital currencies and crypto assets, has prompted central banks around the world to consider whether they should issue their own digital currencies, electronic money issued directly by central banks, held in digital wallets, usable without the intermediation of commercial banks. The ECB has been actively exploring what it calls the digital euro, a potential central bank digital currency for the Eurozone, through a multi-year investigation and preparation phase. The digital euro, if it is eventually launched, would not replace physical euro notes and coins. The ECB has been explicit that the physical currency would remain available, but would provide an additional form of central bank money suitable for the digital age. The conversations about the digital euro raise in updated form some of the same questions that the introduction of the physical euro raised in 2002. What does money mean? What trust does it require? What institutions need to stand behind it? The digital euro would be a liability of the ECB, the most credible institution in the Eurozone, backed by the collective commitment of 20 national central banks and 20 governments. Its introduction would be, in a small but real way, another step in the ongoing project of building European monetary integration, another layer of shared infrastructure on top of the shared currency that already exists. The political landscape in which the euro operates has become more complicated over the past decade. The rise of populist and nationalist political movements in several Eurozone countries, movements that in varying degrees have expressed skepticism about European integration and occasionally about the euro itself, has added a new dimension of uncertainty to the currency's political support. In Italy, political parties that have at times questioned Italy's euro membership have come close to or achieved government power, though in practice no government has moved toward exit, and the logic of remaining, the costs of reintroducing a national currency, the disruption to the financial system, the loss of credibility, has consistently outweighed the rhetorical appeal of sovereignty. The French political debate has included voices at both extremes of the political spectrum that have expressed reservations about the euro, though the mainstream of French politics has remained committed to the currency and to deeper European integration as the framework within which French economic and political ambitions can best be pursued. The German political consensus in favour of the euro has been more consistent, though not unchallenged. The Alternative for Germany party, which emerged partly from academic economists' opposition to the ECB's crisis-era policies, has consistently won representation in the German parliament while never coming close to governmental power. What is perhaps most striking surveying the political landscape of the Eurozone in the present is that the existential threat to the currency, the genuine possibility of a member state exit or a disorderly breakup, which seemed real and immediate at the height of the sovereign debt crisis, has receded to the background. It has not disappeared. The structural tensions remain. The political pressures remain. Future crises will test the commitment again, in ways and at times that cannot be predicted. But the baseline assumption among markets and policymakers and most of the public across the Eurozone has shifted back toward the assumption that the euro is a permanent feature of the landscape, not unquestionable, not without critics, but durable in ways that its most severe crisis demonstrated rather than undermined. This is the paradox at the heart of the euro's story, and perhaps the most important thing to carry away from the long journey we have been on tonight. The currency's survival through its greatest crisis was itself the most powerful demonstration of its durability. Before the crisis, the euro's permanence was assumed on the basis of design and intent, because it had been carefully constructed, because it had been committed to by serious governments, because its designers had tried to build it to last. After the crisis, the euro's durability rests on something more substantial than design or intent. It rests on demonstrated resilience, on the evidence, now available, that it survived conditions that could have destroyed it and did not. There is a question that the euro's story leaves open that is deeper than any of the institutional or political questions we have been discussing. It is the question that sits underneath all of them, the question that the euro was, in a sense, always trying to answer. What is money, really? Money is, in the most technical sense, whatever functions as a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. By these functional criteria, the euro qualifies completely. It circulates, it holds value over time with reasonable reliability, it provides the measuring rod by which economic transactions are denominated across a large and important part of the world, but these functional criteria do not capture what money means to those who use it, the weight it carries that goes beyond its economic function. Money is a statement of trust. When you accept a euro in payment, you are expressing confidence, however unconsciously, that the person who offers it to you has not simply printed it in their basement, that the institution behind it is real and will maintain its value, that the same coin or note will be accepted tomorrow and next month and next year by others who need to be paid. This trust is not primarily in a piece of metal or a piece of paper. It is in the network of institutions, laws, habits, and expectations that give the metal and the paper their value. The euro asked European nations to participate in a shared trust, to accept that the institutions of the eurozone, imperfect and incomplete as they were sufficient to anchor that trust across national boundaries that had, for most of history, been the limits of monetary solidarity. Money is also, and perhaps most fundamentally, a story about community, about who we are together and what we owe each other. National currencies were, among other things, stories that nations told about themselves. The franc was a story about France. The Deutsche Mark was a story about West Germany's economic recovery and its values of stability and discipline. The lira was a story about Italy, about its creativity and its chaos, and its extraordinary capacity to remain coherent despite everything. When these currencies were exchanged for the euro, the stories they carried were not deleted, but were incorporated into a larger story, a story about Europe, about what European nations share, about the ambition to build something together that none of them could build alone. This story is still being written. It is contested. Not everyone agrees on what it should say, on how much solidarity it should demand, on what the common European identity it invokes actually consists of. The contesting of the story is not a sign that it has failed. It is a sign that it is alive, that it matters enough to fight about, that the questions it raises are real questions about real things, about fairness and sovereignty and solidarity and the kind of future that 340 million people, spread across 20 countries with distinct histories and cultures and languages, are trying to build together. The euro is, in the end, an act of collective imagination, an agreement to treat a shared future as more real and more important than the separate pasts that divide. That agreement has been tested and has held, imperfectly and at cost, through conditions that were genuinely severe. It continues to be tested in smaller and larger ways every day that the Eurozone continues to function. And every day that it functions, every transaction conducted in the shared currency, every paycheck received and every bill paid, adds another small increment to the accumulated evidence that the imagination was not entirely wrong, that the shared future being built is real enough to bear the weight being placed on it. You are somewhere in that geography tonight, or connected to it, or descended from it, or simply curious about it in the way that human beings are curious about the large, complicated, imperfect projects that their own species undertakes. The euro exists somewhere in the background of your world, whether or not you have ever held one in your hand. It is part of the story of how the world you inhabit came to be as it is. And now you know a little more of that story than you did when we began, several hours ago, with a traveller standing at a border booth watching small change disappear. The lights are dimmer now, wherever you are. The sounds of the world have grown quieter. There is nothing left that needs your attention tonight. The questions the euro raises can wait until morning, when they will be exactly as real and exactly as interesting as they are now, but will require no more of you than the pleasant possibility of thinking about them with a rested mind. Somewhere in Europe tonight, in a quiet apartment in Lisbon, in a farmhouse in southern France, in a student room in Helsinki, in a narrow street in Athens where the sounds of the evening have died away, someone is reaching into a pocket and finding a coin. A small circle of metal, worn slightly smooth by many hands, carrying on one face the design of the country that minted it, and on the other the design that belongs to all of them. Worth exactly what it is worth, no more and no less, held together by the trust and the imagination of hundreds of millions of people who have agreed, improbably and provisionally, and with great difficulty and at real cost, to share it. That coin is still there, in that pocket, in that quiet. Let it be the last image you carry into sleep tonight. Small and warm and ordinary and in its own modest way remarkable. The product of a long history and an ongoing experiment and a question about Europe and about human community that has not yet been fully answered. You can rest now. The question will still be there in the morning, patient and open, as good questions always are. And so we rest here, at the end of a long and quiet journey through one of the most ambitious things human beings have ever tried to do together. Not the building of a wall or the winning of a war, but something harder in its way, the choosing, freely and repeatedly, to trust. To reach across old divisions and say, perhaps we are more together than we are apart. Perhaps what we share is more real than what separates us. That reaching is the deepest thing the Euro's story contains. Not the treaties or the interest rates or the crisis summits, but the human willingness, fragile and persistent in equal measure, to keep building something that has never existed before, even when the building is difficult, even when the cost is real. You carry that same willingness. Every day that you move through the world, trusting institutions you did not build, depending on systems you did not design, contributing your small and irreplaceable part to the ongoing, imperfect, remarkable project of human civilization, that is enough. That has always been enough. Let your body grow heavy now. Let the thoughts soften and slow. Let the story drift gently away, like a coin settling quietly to the bottom of still water. You are already where you need to be. Sleep well,